August 5, 2025. Grizzly bear kills 2 police officers in remote Montana station. The morning mist clung to the peaks of the crazy mountains like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the granite faces that had stood sentinel over Montana's wilderness for millennia. Officer Brian Matthew Cooper pushed open the heavy wooden door of the Beartooth Remote Police Station at exactly 6:47 a.m., the familiar creak of the hinges cutting through the mountain's silence. At 33, Brian had spent the last 8 years of his life in these mountains, first as a park ranger and now as one of only 12 officers assigned to the remote stations scattered throughout Montana's most isolated regions. His weathered hands, scarred from countless encounters with barbed wire and rocky terrain, gripped a steaming cup of coffee that would be his last. The Beartooth Station sat like a lonely cabin at coordinates 45.2847 degrees north, 109.7512 degrees west, positioned strategically at the intersection of 2 barely maintained gravel roads that served as lifelines to the scattered ranches and cabins dotting the landscape for 60 miles in every direction. Built in 1987 from local timber and reinforced with steel supports, the station consisted of a main room measuring 24 by 16 feet, containing 2 desks, a communications center, a small kitchenette, and a holding cell that had been used exactly 3 times in its 38-year history. A narrow hallway led to a bathroom and a storage room filled with emergency supplies, winter gear, and enough ammunition to outfit a small militia. Behind the station, a gravel path wound 50 yards through lodgepole pines to a smaller cabin that served as temporary quarters for visiting officers or emergency shelter during the brutal Montana winters. The nearest town, Livingston, lay 47 miles to the southeast, while the closest neighbor, rancher Thomas Mackenzie, lived 14 miles down a winding dirt road that became impassable during heavy snows. Brian's partner, Officer Melissa Catherine Wright, would arrive at 7:15 a.m., bringing with her a thermos of the strong black coffee she preferred and a bag of homemade oatmeal cookies baked by her elderly neighbor, Martha Henderson. At 29, Melissa had transferred to the remote stations after 5 years with the Billings Police Department, seeking the solitude and challenge that came with protecting Montana's most isolated communities. Her psychology degree from Montana State University had proven invaluable in dealing with the unique mental health challenges faced by people living in extreme isolation, particularly during the long winter months when some residents didn't see another human being for weeks at a time. The radio crackled to life at 6:52 a.m. with the familiar voice of dispatcher Sarah Chen, broadcasting from the Regional Communications Center in Bozeman, 93 miles to the west. "Beartooth Station, this is dispatch. Radio check over. Brian's response would be logged as the last normal communication from the station. Dispatch, this is Beartooth. Clear reception, all systems normal. Cooper on duty, Wright arriving shortly, over." The timestamp on that transmission would later become crucial evidence in the investigation that would consume the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks for the next 8 months. What Brian couldn't know as he settled into his chair and opened the duty log was that 3 miles to the north, a massive grizzly bear designated as Bear 211 by wildlife biologists was already moving in the direction of the station. The bear, a male weighing approximately 847 pounds and standing 7 feet at the shoulder, had been tracked intermittently by GPS collar since 2023, when he'd been captured and tagged after killing 2 steers on the Mackenzie Ranch. Bear 211's territory covered nearly 200 square miles of the most rugged terrain in Montana, from the alpine meadows above treeline to the valley floors where he fed on spawning trout and whatever carrion he could scavenge. Dr. Catherine Phillips, the lead grizzly researcher for the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Department, had been studying Bear 211's behavior patterns for 2 years. Her field notes, later examined as evidence, described him as exceptionally large for his age class, approximately 15 years old, showing increased territorial aggression since the 2024 drought reduced natural food sources by an estimated 40%. The bear had demonstrated unusual behavior throughout the summer of 2025, approaching human structures with increasing frequency and showing less fear response to human scent and activity than typical for the population. The drought that had gripped Montana for the previous 14 months had created a cascade of ecological disruptions. Whitebark pine nuts, a crucial fall food source for grizzlies, had failed almost completely. The berry crop was down 70% from normal years. Cutthroat trout populations in the high mountain lakes had crashed due to low water levels and elevated temperatures. These factors combined to create what wildlife biologists termed a perfect storm of food scarcity that forced bears to expand their foraging ranges and increasingly look to human food sources for survival. Bear 211's GPS collar had transmitted its last signal on July 28, 2025, when the bear was located approximately 12 miles northeast of the Beartooth Station. The collar's failure wasn't uncommon. The devices typically lasted 2 to 3 years before battery failure or physical damage rendered them inoperative. However, the loss of telemetry data meant that Bear 211's movements in the week leading up to August 5th remained a mystery that would haunt investigators. Melissa Wright's white Ford Explorer crested the hill approaching the station at exactly 7:14 a.m., her headlights cutting through the lingering pre-dawn darkness. She'd driven the 47 miles from her small apartment in Livingston, a journey that took her through some of the most spectacular and isolated country in North America. The drive typically took 58 minutes, winding through river valleys and over mountain passes where elk often grazed within yards of the road and golden eagles soared overhead riding thermals rising from sun-warmed meadows. As she parked beside Brian's patrol vehicle, Melissa noticed the unusual silence. Normally, the area around the station bustled with the activity of small wildlife, ground squirrels, chipmunks, and various bird species that had adapted to the human presence. This morning, the forest felt empty, though she attributed the silence to the approaching weather system that meteorologists were tracking across the Pacific Northwest. The National Weather Service had issued a severe weather watch for the region, predicting thunderstorms with possible hail and wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour beginning around noon. Inside the station, Brian was reviewing the overnight reports transmitted from dispatch. 3 calls had come in during the previous evening, a domestic disturbance at the Morrison Ranch that had been resolved without police intervention, a report of suspicious lights near an abandoned mining claim that turned out to be teenagers camping without permits, and a concerned call from Martha Henderson about her missing cat, Whiskers, who had eventually returned home on his own. The routine nature of these calls reflected the typical pace of life in Montana's remote regions, where serious crime was rare, but the challenges of isolation created their own unique set of problems. The morning routine that Brian and Melissa had established over their 6 months working together was methodical and comforting in its predictability. Brian would brief Melissa on any overnight developments while she prepared her workspace and checked the equipment. They would then review their patrol schedule, coordinate with dispatch, and begin their daily rounds of the sprawling territory they were responsible for protecting. Their patrol area encompassed 847 square miles of some of the most challenging terrain in the continental United States, including sections of the Gallatin National Forest, private ranch land, mining claims, hunting lodges, and scattered homesteads accessible only by 4-wheel drive vehicles. At 7:23 a.m., Melissa radioed dispatch to confirm her arrival and receive any updated information about the weather system approaching from the west. Dispatcher Sarah Chen's voice crackled through the radio with an updated forecast. Beartooth Station. Be advised, weather service has upgraded to severe thunderstorm warning, expected arrival 11:30 to 12 hours. Recommend completing outdoor activities early. Also, Fish and Wildlife reports increased bear activity in Sector 7. Recommend extra caution on northern routes. The mention of increased bear activity wasn't unusual for this time of year. August was traditionally a time when bears became more active in their search for food to build fat reserves for winter hibernation. However, the severe drought conditions had made food sources scarce, leading to what wildlife managers termed hyperphagia, an intensified feeding behavior that could make bears more aggressive and willing to take risks they would normally avoid. Sector 7 of their patrol area included a 12-mile stretch of Forest Service roads that provided access to several hunting cabins and a defunct mining operation. The area was known for high concentrations of both black bears and grizzlies, particularly during late summer when various berry species ripened in the clearings left by previous forest fires. Brian and Melissa had encountered bears on 17 separate occasions during their time working together, following established protocols for wildlife encounters that emphasized maintaining distance, making noise to avoid surprise encounters, and carrying both bear spray and firearms as last resort deterrents. The morning patrol began at 7:45 a.m. with a routine check of the Mackenzie Ranch, where Thomas Mackenzie, a 72-year-old rancher, lived alone on 3,400 acres of grazing land. Mackenzie's ranch had been in his family for 4 generations, and he possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of local wildlife patterns that had proven invaluable to both law enforcement and wildlife managers. His great-grandfather had homesteaded the land in 1892, and family records documented bear encounters dating back to the early 1900s, providing a historical perspective on grizzly behavior that was unique in the region. Mackenzie met them at his front gate, as was his custom, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the same faded denim jacket he'd worn every morning for the past 15 years. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, with hands the size of dinner plates, Mackenzie cut an imposing figure, despite his age. His pale blue eyes, set deep in a face weathered by decades of mountain winters, missed nothing that moved on his property. "Morning, officers," Mackenzie said, his voice carrying the distinctive drawl of someone who'd spent their entire life in rural Montana. "Noticed some unusual tracks near the south pasture yesterday evening. Grizzly, big one, heading northeast toward your station area." Tracks were fresh, probably made sometime after the afternoon rain. Brian and Melissa exchanged glances. Mackenzie's ability to track wildlife was legendary throughout the region, and his assessments were trusted implicitly by both law enforcement and wildlife biologists. If he said tracks were fresh and heading toward the station, it was information that demanded attention. "How big would you estimate?" Melissa asked, pulling out her field notebook to record the information. Mackenzie scratched his grizzled chin, considering the question carefully. Front paw print measured just over 11 inches, back paw close to 14. That's a mature boar, probably pushing 800 pounds or better. Haven't seen tracks that size in this area for maybe 3-4 years. The size estimates were concerning. A grizzly bear with 11-inch front paw prints would indeed be in the 800-pound range, making it one of the largest bears documented in the region. Bears of that size were typically older males with well-established territories and behavioral patterns that rarely brought them into contact with human structures. The fact that such a bear was moving toward populated areas suggested either injury, illness, or the kind of extreme food stress that could make any animal unpredictable. Brian made a note to contact the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Bear Management Team when they returned to the station. Protocol required reporting any evidence of large predators in proximity to human habitation, and Mackenzie's track information would be valuable for wildlife managers trying to monitor bear populations and movement patterns. The patrol continued with stops at 3 hunting cabins in the Willow Creek drainage, all of which were unoccupied until the upcoming hunting season. Each cabin was checked for signs of break-ins, vandalism, or illegal activity, as well as evidence of wildlife intrusion. Bears were notorious for breaking into cabins in search of food, and improperly secured structures often suffered extensive damage when hungry bears tore through walls, windows, or doors to reach anything edible inside. At the old Shamrock mine site, abandoned since copper prices crashed in 1987, they discovered evidence that someone had been camping in one of the abandoned buildings. Empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and food wrappers indicated recent human activity, possibly hunters scouting the area in advance of the season or teenagers seeking privacy away from parental supervision. While camping in abandoned mines was technically trespassing, it was a minor violation that typically resulted in warnings rather than citations. The discovery of human activity at the mine site was significant for reasons that wouldn't become apparent until much later. The camping debris included several cans of tuna fish and a bag of dog food that had been torn open and scattered, creating exactly the kind of food scent that could attract bears from miles away. The campers, whoever they were, had unknowingly created a situation that would factor into the tragic events that followed. By 9:30 a.m., Brian and Melissa had completed their northern patrol route and were heading back toward the station to file their reports and coordinate with dispatch regarding the severe weather warning. The sky had taken on an ominous cast, with towering cumulonimbus clouds building over the peaks to the west. Lightning flickered occasionally in the distance, still too far away to hear thunder, but close enough to sense the electrical tension building in the atmosphere. As they drove the gravel road leading back to the station, Melissa noticed an unusual silence in the forest. Birds that normally called from the trees along the roadway were absent, and the typical scurrying of small mammals through the underbrush had ceased entirely. Wildlife often went quiet before severe weather, but this silence felt different, deeper and more complete than weather alone could explain. "You notice how quiet it is?" she asked Brian, who was driving with his window down to listen for aircraft. A medical helicopter was scheduled to transport an injured rancher from the Sweetgrass Hills area to the trauma center in Billings, and pilots often requested radio contact with remote stations to report weather conditions along their flight routes. "Yeah, it's strange," Brian replied, slowing the vehicle as they approached a curve where visibility was limited by dense stands of Douglas fir. "Could be the weather, but I've never seen it this quiet before a storm." Unknown to both officers, the silence was indeed related to their presence, not their human presence, but the presence of Bear 211, who had been paralleling their route through the forest for the past 20 minutes. The massive grizzly was demonstrating hunting behavior typically associated with pursuing prey animals, using the terrain and vegetation to remain concealed while tracking the patrol vehicle's movement. This behavior was so unusual for grizzly-human interactions that wildlife experts would later spend months analyzing the implications. Grizzly bears are not typically pursuit predators when it comes to humans. Most bear-human encounters result from surprise meetings or food-related conflicts, not from bears actively hunting people. However, Bear 211's behavior suggested something far more concerning, a predatory focus that implied either severe desperation driven by starvation or a behavioral abnormality that made him view humans as potential prey rather than threats to be avoided. At 9:47 a.m., they arrived back at the station to find that the wind had picked up significantly. Pine trees swayed and creaked around the building, and the American flag mounted on the pole beside the front door snapped and fluttered with sharp cracking sounds. The atmospheric pressure was dropping rapidly, and both officers could feel the approaching storm system in their bones, the way mountain people always could. Inside the station, Brian began preparing the routine reports while Melissa contacted dispatch to update their status and request information about the medical helicopter flight. The radio communication was briefly interrupted by static caused by the building electrical activity in the atmosphere. But Sarah Chen's voice came through clearly enough to confirm that the helicopter had departed Billings at 9:35 a.m. and was expected to reach the pickup location at 10:15 a.m. Beartooth Station. Also be advised that Fish and Wildlife has requested you contact Dr. Catherine Phillips regarding the bear activity report from Sector 7. Sarah's voice crackled through the radio. She's at the field station in Livingston and wants to coordinate tracking efforts if possible. Brian made note of the request and dialed Dr. Phillips' direct line using the station's landline telephone. The call connected after 3 rings, and Phillips' voice carried the urgency that had characterized all bear management activities throughout the drought-plagued summer. "Officer Cooper, thank you for calling," Dr. Phillips said without preamble. "We've had reports of unusual bear behavior throughout the region over the past week. A large male grizzly killed and partially consumed a bull elk just 8 miles from your location yesterday. That's significant because healthy grizzlies typically scavenge elk kills rather than hunting adult bulls. It suggests either severe nutritional stress or behavioral changes that we need to monitor closely." The information about the elk kill was troubling for several reasons. Adult bull elk in August were at peak physical condition, weighing 700 to 900 pounds and possessing formidable antlers and aggressive defensive instincts. For a bear to successfully kill a healthy bull elk required exceptional size, strength, and hunting ability. More concerning was the location of the kill site. Just 8 miles from the station placed it well within the territory that Bear 211 had been documented using throughout the summer. "We found tracks at the Mackenzie place this morning," Brian reported. "Large grizzly heading northeast toward our area. Mackenzie estimated the bear at 800 pounds based on track size." There was a pause on the line before Dr. Phillips responded, and when she did, her voice carried a note of concern that made both officers pay closer attention. "That size estimate matches what we'd expect for Bear 211, a male we've been tracking for 2 years. His collar stopped transmitting last week, but his last known location was consistent with movement toward your area. This is a bear with a history of aggressive encounters and no documented fear response to humans or human scent." The revelation that they were potentially dealing with Bear 211 changed the entire context of the morning's patrol. Bear 211 was not just any grizzly. He was a documented problem bear with a behavioral profile that had already resulted in livestock kills and property damage. Wildlife managers had debated relocating or euthanizing him on 3 separate occasions, but his GPS data had shown him remaining primarily in wilderness areas away from human contact. Dr. Phillips continued her briefing with information that would prove critically important in the hours ahead. Bear 211 has demonstrated tool use behavior, problem-solving abilities that exceed normal parameters, and what we can only describe as tactical thinking in his approach to obtaining food. He's learned to associate human scent with food sources and has shown progressive habituation to human presence over the past 2 seasons. The term tactical thinking in reference to bear behavior was unusual enough that Melissa asked for clarification. Dr. Phillips explained that Bear 211 had been observed using rocks to break into metal containers, timing his approaches to human structures to coincide with periods of minimal activity, and demonstrating memory for locations where he'd successfully obtained food even after intervals of several months. "What's our recommended protocol if we encounter this bear?" Brian asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Do not attempt to approach or interact with Bear 211 under any circumstances, Dr. Phillips replied firmly. If you sight him, maintain maximum distance and contact our emergency response team immediately. This bear's behavioral profile suggests a level of food conditioning and human association that makes him extremely dangerous. We have authorization for lethal removal if he poses an immediate threat to human safety. The conversation concluded with Dr. Phillips requesting that they report any sign of bear activity, no matter how minor, and promising to have a response team on standby throughout the day. As Brian hung up the phone, both officers felt the weight of responsibility that came with protecting people in an environment where humans were vastly outnumbered by predators capable of killing them with minimal effort. At 10:15 a.m., the medical helicopter passed overhead, its distinctive whoop, whoop, whoop sound temporarily drowning out the increasing wind noise. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio requesting a weather update, and Melissa provided current conditions and the latest forecast information. The helicopter continued northwest toward its pickup location, disappearing into the grey clouds that were building with ominous speed. The weather system was arriving ahead of schedule, and both officers could see lightning strikes beginning to hit the peaks surrounding their valley. Thunder rolled across the landscape in increasing frequency, and the first scattered raindrops began spattering against the station windows. Within minutes, the sporadic drops had become a steady rainfall that quickly intensified to a heavy downpour. Mountain storms in this region were notorious for their sudden intensity and potential danger. Lightning strikes could ignite forest fires even during heavy rain, and flash flooding was a constant threat in the narrow valleys and drainage systems that channeled runoff from thousands of acres of steep terrain. Protocol required that they remain at the station during severe weather unless responding to emergency calls, both for their own safety and to maintain radio communication with dispatch. As the storm intensified, Melissa noticed that their radio communications with dispatch were becoming increasingly difficult due to atmospheric interference. Static filled more and more of each transmission, and Sarah Chen's voice was often completely obscured by electronic noise. This communication difficulty would prove to be a critical factor in the tragedy that was now less than 2 hours away. At 10:45 a.m., with rain hammering against the station roof and lightning strikes visible every few seconds, Brian attempted to contact dispatch for a routine check-in. The radio produced only static and electronic squealing sounds that made further communication impossible. He tried switching to different frequencies and adjusting the antenna orientation, but the storm's electrical activity was simply too intense for their equipment to function effectively. The loss of radio communication left them isolated in a way that would have been unthinkable just decades earlier. The station's landline telephone remained functional, but it provided only a single point of contact with the outside world. If that connection failed, they would be completely cut off from assistance until the storm passed and radio communication could be re-established. Neither officer was particularly concerned about the temporary communication blackout. Severe weather routinely disrupted radio systems throughout the region, and their protocols accounted for such situations. They had emergency supplies, backup power systems, and detailed procedures for maintaining security and safety during extended periods of isolation. What they couldn't account for was the presence of Bear 211, who was now less than half a mile from the station and closing the distance with deliberate intent. The bear had used the noise and confusion of the storm to mask his approach, demonstrating the kind of tactical thinking that Dr. Phillips had warned them about. Unlike normal bear behavior, which typically involved avoiding human contact during severe weather, Bear 211 was using the storm as cover for what could only be described as a planned approach to the station. Wildlife cameras positioned throughout the region for research purposes would later reveal that Bear 211 had spent the previous week systematically investigating human structures within a 15-mile radius of the station. He'd been observed at hunting cabins, ranch buildings, and even the abandoned mine site, where the camping debris had created food scents that reinforced his association between human presence and feeding opportunities. At 11:15 a.m., the storm reached peak intensity. Hail began falling mixed with the heavy rain, creating a deafening drumbeat against the station's metal roof. Lightning strikes were hitting the surrounding peaks every few seconds, and the thunder was a continuous rolling sound that made conversation inside the station difficult. Both officers had experienced numerous mountain storms, but the intensity of this system was unusual, even by local standards. Brian was attempting to update their patrol log when he noticed movement outside the front window. At first, he assumed it was debris blown by the wind, branches, leaves, or other material stirred up by the storm's intensity. However, as he watched more carefully, the movement appeared too purposeful and coordinated to be random debris. "Melissa, take a look at this," he called, gesturing toward the window without taking his eyes off the area where he'd detected motion. Melissa moved to the window and peered through the rain-streaked glass into the storm-darkened forest. For several seconds she saw nothing unusual, just the wild thrashing of pine trees and the vertical sheets of rain that limited visibility to perhaps 30 yards. Then, in a brief lull between lightning strikes, she saw what had caught Brian's attention. Bear 211 was visible between two large pine trees, approximately 50 yards from the station, partially concealed by a fallen log, but clearly recognizable as a massive grizzly bear. He was not moving in the random, purposeless way that bears typically exhibited when caught in severe weather. Instead, he appeared to be studying the station, his massive head swiveling slowly as he examined the building and its surroundings. "That's a big bear," Melissa said quietly, though the storm noise made normal conversation difficult. "He's not acting right." Brian was already moving toward the radio, hoping that the storm's intensity might have lessened enough to allow emergency communication with dispatch. However, the radio produced only the same static and electronic interference that had plagued them for the past 30 minutes. He switched to the emergency frequency and attempted to broadcast a mayday call, but there was no indication that his transmission was being received. The landline telephone represented their only remaining communication option, and Brian quickly dialed the emergency dispatch number while keeping one eye on the window where Bear 211 remained visible. The phone rang twice before connecting to Sarah Chen's familiar voice. "Dispatch, this is Cooper at Beartooth Station. We have a large grizzly bear, approximately 50 yards from the station, showing unusual behavior. Storm conditions have knocked out radio communication. Request immediate assistance from Fish and Wildlife Bear Response Team." Sarah's response was partially obscured by static on the phone line, but her words were clear enough. "Copy Beartooth Station. Bear sighting reported. Be advised weather conditions have grounded helicopter response until storm passes. Fish and Wildlife Team is en route by vehicle, but estimated arrival time is 90 minutes due to weather and road conditions." 90 minutes felt like an eternity when faced with a bear that was demonstrating predatory behavior rather than the typical avoidance response. Brian acknowledged the dispatch information and hung up the phone, knowing that they were essentially on their own until the storm passed and help could arrive. At the window, Melissa continued observing Bear 211's behavior with growing concern. The bear had moved closer to the station, now positioned behind a thick stand of aspens approximately 30 yards away. His body language suggested intense focus and what could only be described as calculation as he studied the building and its potential entry points. "He's looking for a way in," she said, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. Bears breaking into buildings was not uncommon, but they typically did so in an opportunistic manner when structures were unoccupied and food scents were present. The deliberate, systematic way that Bear 211 was examining the station suggested something far more sophisticated and dangerous. Brian joined her at the window, bringing with him the station's spotting scope that allowed for detailed observation of distant objects. Through the scope's magnification, Bear 211's behavior became even more disturbing. The bear was clearly evaluating different approaches to the building, testing potential routes while remaining partially concealed by the natural vegetation. The station had been designed with wildlife encounters in mind. All windows were equipped with heavy shutters that could be secured from inside, and the main door was reinforced steel mounted in a steel frame anchored deep into the log walls. However, these security measures were intended to deter opportunistic break-ins by bears seeking food, not focused attempts by an animal with the size and determination that Bear 211 was displaying. At 11:35 a.m., Bear 211 made his first direct approach toward the station. Rather than moving in a straight line, he used the available cover to remain partially concealed while advancing, demonstrating a level of tactical awareness that neither officer had seen in previous bear encounters. His movements were deliberate and calculated, more like those of a predator stalking prey than a scavenging bear investigating a potential food source. "This isn't normal bear behavior," Brian said, his voice tight with concern. "He's hunting." The realization that they were being hunted by an 800-pound predator capable of breaking through most barriers changed their entire approach to the situation. Protocol for bear encounters assumed that bears would eventually lose interest and move away, if not provoked or if food sources were properly secured. However, predatory behavior suggested that Bear 211 viewed them not as threats to be avoided, but as potential prey to be captured. Melissa moved away from the window and began checking their defensive equipment. The station was equipped with 2 canisters of bear spray, a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with slugs specifically designed for large predators, and Brian's service pistol chambered in .45 ACP. While these weapons were potentially effective against bears, their success depended entirely on accurate shot placement and the willingness of the bear to break off an attack when wounded. The bear spray represented their first line of defense, effective up to approximately 20 feet and capable of temporarily incapacitating even large grizzlies. However, the spray's effectiveness was significantly reduced in windy conditions, and the storm raging outside would likely disperse the chemical before it could reach its target. At 11:42 a.m., Bear 211 reached the perimeter of the station clearing and paused behind the last line of trees that provided concealment. From this position, he would have to cross approximately 20 yards of open ground to reach the building, exposure that seemed to give him pause as he continued his systematic evaluation of the situation. Both officers were now positioned where they could observe the bear while remaining ready to implement their emergency response procedures. The station's layout provided limited options for defense or escape. The main room offered good visibility through multiple windows, but no secondary exit routes. The storage room at the rear of the building had a small window that could potentially serve as an escape route, but it would require breaking the glass and climbing through an opening barely large enough for an adult human. The psychological impact of being stalked by a predator of Bear 211 size and intelligence was beginning to affect both officers. Humans are not accustomed to being prey animals, and the helpless feeling that comes with being hunted by a superior predator triggers deep evolutionary responses that can interfere with rational decision-making. Brian found himself checking and rechecking his weapons, while Melissa couldn't stop moving from window to monitor the bear's position. At 11:47 a.m., Bear 211 began his final approach toward the station. He moved with surprising speed and agility for an animal of his size, covering the 20 yards of open ground in less than 10 seconds. Rather than approaching the main door or any of the windows directly, he circled around to the side of the building where a propane tank and generator were housed under a metal shelter. The sound of the bear investigating the utility area was audible even over the storm noise, metallic clanging and scraping sounds as he manipulated objects with his massive paws. Bears were notorious for their ability to open containers and manipulate complex mechanisms, and Bear 211's investigation of the utility area suggested that he was looking for vulnerabilities in the building's structure or systems. "He's at the generator," Brian reported, moving to the side window where he could observe the bear's activities. "Looks like he's trying to figure out how things work." The generator and propane system were essential for the station's operation, providing power for communications equipment, lighting, and heating. If Bear 211 damaged these systems, their situation would become even more desperate, as they would lose their backup power source and potentially their heating system if the storm continued into the evening. Through the window, Brian could see Bear 211 standing on his hind legs to examine the generator housing, his massive front paws manipulating the metal enclosure with surprising dexterity. The bear's intelligence was evident in his methodical approach, rather than simply destroying things in random fashion. He appeared to be studying the mechanical systems to understand their function and identify potential weaknesses. At 11:52 a.m., Bear 211 found what he was looking for. The generator housing had a maintenance access panel secured with simple latches rather than locks, designed for easy access by service technicians. The bear's powerful claws made short work of the latches, and within seconds he had the panel open and was reaching inside with his massive paws. The sound of tearing metal and breaking components carried clearly through the storm noise, followed by the distinctive sputter and silence as the generator's engine died. Emergency lighting immediately activated inside the station, powered by battery backup systems, but the loss of main power meant that their radio equipment was now operating on limited battery reserves. "Generators down," Brian announced unnecessarily, as the change in lighting and the cessation of electrical humming made the power loss obvious. He killed it deliberately. The implications were terrifying. Bears didn't typically disable mechanical systems unless they were specifically looking to eliminate threats or obstacles. Bear 211's actions suggested not only intelligence, but also a plan. He was systematically removing their defenses and communication capabilities in preparation for what could only be a deliberate attack on the station itself. Melissa was already on the phone with dispatch, reporting the escalation in the bears' behavior and their deteriorating situation. However, the response remained the same. Help was en route, but still at least an hour away due to the severe weather conditions that had made helicopter response impossible and forced ground units to travel slowly on dangerous mountain roads. At 11:55 a.m., Bear 211 moved to the front of the station and began investigating the main entrance. The door was solid steel, mounted in a steel frame, designed to withstand significant force, but the bear's size and strength made even these robust security measures questionable. Through the front window, both officers could see him examining the door frame, testing the strength of the mounting points, and studying the hinges with the focused attention of someone planning a break-in. The bear's behavior had moved far beyond anything either officer had encountered in their combined 13 years of law enforcement experience. This was not an animal acting on instinct or desperation. This was a predator executing a plan based on observation, analysis, and calculated decision-making. "He's testing the door," Melissa reported from her position near the front window, "looking for weak points." Bear 211's examination of the door was thorough and systematic. He used his claws to probe the gaps around the frame, testing the give in the mounting system. He examined the hinges, apparently understanding that they represented potential failure points. Most disturbing, he seemed to be calculating the force required to breach the barrier, rearing up on his hind legs to study the upper portions of the frame where structural stress would be concentrated. At exactly 12 p.m., Bear 211 made his first attempt to breach the station's defenses. Rising to his full height of 7 feet, he brought both front paws down against the door with tremendous force. The impact sent shockwaves through the entire building, rattling windows and causing items on shelves to shift and fall. The door held, but both officers could see that the frame had shifted slightly under the tremendous force. "Door frames damaged," Brian announced, moving to position himself where he could bring the shotgun to bear if the bear succeeded in breaking through. Next hit might do it. The psychological impact of the attack was as devastating as the physical damage. Both officers understood that they were facing a predator capable of breaking through barriers designed to keep out normal wildlife threats. The station had been their refuge, their safe space in the wilderness, but Bear 211 was systematically turning it into a trap. Bear 211's second assault on the door came 30 seconds later, this time with even greater force. The massive grizzly reared up to his full height and threw his entire 800-pound body against the door, front paws striking the steel surface with impacts that sounded like gunshots. The door frame groaned under the assault, and both officers could see daylight appearing around the edges where the frame was pulling away from the log walls. "Frame's failing," Melissa called out, her voice tight with controlled fear. "He's going to get through." The third impact came immediately, without pause, for Bear 211 to assess the damage. This time, the upper hinge mount tore partially free from the wall, causing the door to sag at an angle that left a gap several inches wide at the top. The bear's massive head appeared in the gap immediately, his dark eyes scanning the interior of the station with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. Brian raised the shotgun, hoping that the sight and sound of the weapon might deter the bear, but Bear 211 showed no fear response whatsoever. Instead, he began working to widen the gap, using his claws and teeth to tear at the damaged frame with mechanical persistence. Shots fired would be the last entry in the Beartooth Station log, though neither officer would survive to complete the paperwork. At 12:03 p.m., as Bear 211's massive head and shoulders began forcing their way through the damaged doorway, Brian fired the first shot from the shotgun, aiming for the center of the bear's skull at a range of less than 8 feet. The slug struck Bear 211 in the left side of his head, tearing away fur and flesh, but failing to penetrate the heavy bone structure that protected his brain. The impact staggered him momentarily, but rather than retreating, the massive grizzly responded with increased aggression, roaring with a sound that seemed to shake the entire building. Blood streaming from his head wound, Bear 211 renewed his assault on the doorway with savage fury. His massive paws tore at the damaged frame, ripping away chunks of steel and wood as he forced his way through the opening. The sight of an 800-pound predator breaking through what had seemed like impenetrable defenses was beyond anything either officer had been trained to handle. Brian's second shot, fired at point-blank range as the bear's shoulders cleared the doorway, struck Bear 211 in the chest, but failed to stop his advance. Grizzly bears possessed massive muscle and bone structure, specifically evolved to absorb tremendous physical punishment. And even well-placed shots with appropriate ammunition were not guaranteed to immediately incapacitate such a massive animal. Melissa had drawn her service pistol and was firing as rapidly as accuracy allowed, her shots striking the bear in the torso and head. However, the .40 caliber ammunition, while effective against human threats, was marginal for stopping an enraged grizzly bear of Bear 211's size. Each shot produced sprays of blood and apparent impact, but none succeeded in stopping the bear's determined advance into the station. Bear 211's entry into the main room of the station marked the beginning of an attack that would be reconstructed later from physical evidence, as neither officer survived to provide testimony. The scene that response teams would discover hours later told a story of desperate resistance against overwhelming predatory force. Brian Cooper's final moments were spent trying to reload the shotgun while backing toward the storage room, hoping to create distance and time for more effective shots. However, Bear 211's speed and agility allowed him to close the gap before Brian could chamber another round. The massive grizzly struck Brian with his right front paw, a blow that investigators would later determine generated enough force to break multiple ribs and cause massive internal injuries. Melissa Wright's last act was an attempt to reach the storage room where emergency medical supplies and additional ammunition were kept. Her service pistol was found empty, all 15 rounds having been fired during the encounter. Evidence at the scene suggested that she had maintained fire discipline and accuracy, even under the extreme stress of the attack, with most of her shots striking center mass on the massive bear. The attack itself lasted less than 3 minutes, but the savagery was complete and devastating. Bear 211's predatory instincts, honed by millions of years of evolution and sharpened by weeks of food stress and behavioral conditioning, proved overwhelmingly superior to human technology and training. The station's robust construction, modern weapons and emergency protocols were simply inadequate when faced with an 800-pound predator operating with intelligent planning and focused aggression. At 12:06 p.m., the Beartooth remote police station fell silent except for the storm winds and the sounds of Bear 211 investigating his conquest. The massive grizzly spent the next 47 minutes inside the station, systematically destroying equipment and consuming anything remotely edible. Radio equipment was smashed, furniture was overturned, and the entire interior was transformed into a scene of destruction that would haunt investigators for years to come. The first indication that something was wrong came at 1:15 p.m. when dispatcher Sarah Chen attempted to contact the station for a routine check-in. The radio call produced only static, which wasn't unusual given the storm conditions, but the lack of response to repeated attempts became concerning as the weather began to clear around 1:30 p.m. Dr. Catherine Phillips and the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Bear Response Team arrived at the Mackenzie Ranch at 1:45 p.m., planning to use it as a staging area for their investigation of Bear 211's reported presence in the area. Thomas Mackenzie met them at his front gate with information that would prove crucial to understanding the timeline of events. "Heard gunshots around noon," Mackenzie reported without preamble. 6, maybe 7 shots from the direction of the police station. Weren't hunting shots. Too rapid. Too many. Sounded like a firefight. The report of gunfire shifted the entire response from a routine wildlife management operation to an emergency rescue mission. Dr. Phillips immediately contacted dispatch to report the possibility of an officer-involved shooting, while the Bear Response Team prepared their specialized equipment for what was now clearly a dangerous situation. The approach to the station was conducted with extreme caution, as the possibility of a wounded and aggressive bear in the area made standard emergency response protocols inadequate. The team consisted of Dr. Phillips, 2 wildlife biologists, 4 specially trained Montana Highway Patrol officers, and a paramedic team equipped for trauma response in wilderness conditions. At 2:20 p.m., the response team reached a position approximately 200 yards from the station, where they could observe the building through spotting scopes. What they saw confirmed their worst fears and exceeded their most pessimistic expectations. The front door of the station was completely destroyed, hanging at an angle that indicated massive structural damage. Through the opening, they could see overturned furniture and clear evidence of a violent struggle. Bear 211 was visible through the destroyed doorway, still inside the station, feeding on what appeared to be human remains. The massive grizzly showed no awareness of the response team's presence, focused entirely on his feeding activity with the single-minded intensity that characterized predators at a kill site. "Jesus Christ," whispered Montana Highway Patrol Sergeant James Morrison, a 20-year veteran who had responded to countless wildlife-human conflicts but had never seen anything approaching the scene before them. "That bear's eating people." The tactical situation was unprecedented in Montana law enforcement history. Standard protocol for dealing with predatory bears called for immediate lethal response, but the confined space of the station interior and the possibility that one of the officers might still be alive complicated any plan for engaging the bear with firearms. Dr. Phillips made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her career. "We have to assume both officers are deceased," she announced to the response team. "Our priority is public safety and preventing this bear from leaving the area. He's demonstrated predatory behavior toward humans and must be considered an immediate threat to anyone in the region." The first shot was fired at 2:31 p.m. by Highway Patrol Officer Daniel Chen, using a .300 Winchester Magnum rifle specifically designed for large game. The bullet struck Bear 211 in the center of his back as he fed, severing his spine and immediately dropping him to the floor of the station. However, the massive grizzly was not dead, and his roars of pain and rage could be heard clearly by the response team 200 yards away. The next 20 minutes involved a careful approach to the station, with armed officers maintaining overlapping fields of fire, while Dr. Phillips and the paramedic team prepared for whatever they might find inside. Each step toward the destroyed building revealed new evidence of the catastrophic violence that had occurred during the storm. Bear 211 died from a second rifle shot fired at close range as the response team reached the station entrance. Dr. Phillips's field notes, written immediately after the encounter, described the scene inside as the most disturbing wildlife-human conflict I have encountered in 15 years of bear research. The official investigation into the deaths of officers Brian Cooper and Melissa Wright would eventually span 8 months and involve experts from across North America. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, and bear researchers from Alaska and Canada all contributed to understanding how such a tragedy could have occurred. Brian Cooper's body was found in the main room of the station, surrounded by evidence of his desperate final fight. The shotgun lay nearby, empty shells scattered across the floor, indicating he had managed to fire both barrels before being overwhelmed. Medical examination revealed massive trauma consistent with bear attack, including claw marks and bite wounds that indicated Bear 211's determination to kill, rather than simply drive away a threat. Melissa Wright was discovered in the storage room, where she had apparently made a final attempt to reach additional ammunition or emergency equipment. Her service pistol was empty, and ballistic evidence showed that she had maintained accurate fire even under extreme duress, with 14 of her 15 shots striking the massive bear. However, even multiple bullet wounds had not been sufficient to stop Bear 211's attack. The physical evidence at the scene told a story of professionals doing everything right according to their training, but facing a threat that exceeded any reasonable expectations. The station's security measures had delayed Bear 211's entry, but ultimately proved inadequate against his size and determination. The officer's weapons had inflicted significant damage on the bear, but had not been sufficient to stop his predatory assault. Dr. Catherine Phillips' analysis of Bear 211's behavior provided crucial insights into how such an attack could have occurred. This bear demonstrated planning, tool use, and tactical thinking that we rarely see in grisly human interactions, her report concluded. The systematic approach to disabling the generator, testing structural defenses, and maintaining focus despite multiple gunshot wounds suggests either exceptional intelligence or behavioral modification caused by extreme environmental stress. The autopsy of Bear 211 revealed an animal in severe physical condition despite his massive size. His stomach contents included pine bark, tree roots, and other materials that indicated severe malnutrition despite the area's reputation for abundant wildlife. Body fat reserves were less than half of normal for a bear of his age and size, explaining the desperate behavior that had driven him to view humans as potential prey. Tissue analysis revealed elevated levels of stress hormones consistent with chronic starvation, as well as evidence of internal parasites that would have further compromised his health. Most significantly, examination of his brain tissue showed signs of chronic inflammation that may have affected his behavior and decision-making processes. The environmental factors that contributed to the tragedy extended far beyond the drought conditions that had reduced natural food sources. Climate change had altered precipitation patterns throughout the region, creating a cascade of ecological disruptions that affected everything from berry production to fish populations. The investigation revealed that Bear 211 was not an isolated case. Wildlife managers across the northwestern United States were documenting similar behavioral changes in bear populations facing increased competition for declining food resources. Thomas Mackenzie's testimony provided crucial timeline information and context for understanding Bear 211's movements in the days leading up to the attack. Trail cameras on the Mackenzie Ranch had captured images of the massive grizzly on 3 separate occasions during the week prior to August 5th, each time moving in the direction of areas with known human activity. That bear was learning, Mackenzie told investigators during his formal interview. You could see it in the way he moved, the way he studied things. He wasn't just wandering around looking for food, he was planning something. The camping debris discovered at the abandoned Shamrock mine site proved to be a significant factor in the tragedy. Analysis of the scattered food containers revealed scent compounds that would have been detectable by bears from distances of several miles. The unknown campers had unknowingly created an attractant that drew Bear 211 into the area and reinforced his association between human presence and food availability. Despite extensive investigation, the identity of the campers was never established. However, their careless food storage practices had contributed directly to creating the conditions that made the attack possible. The incident led to stricter enforcement of food storage regulations throughout Montana's wilderness areas and increased education programs for outdoor recreation users. The response to the tragedy involved multiple agencies and hundreds of personnel over the following weeks. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks implemented emergency protocols for bear management throughout the region, including enhanced monitoring of all known problem bears and increased removal operations for animals showing aggressive behavior toward humans. Search and rescue teams conducted systematic sweeps of the area to ensure that no other predatory bears were present, while wildlife biologists worked to identify and address the environmental factors that had contributed to Bear 211's behavioral changes. The investigation revealed systemic problems with wildlife management in drought-affected areas that required immediate attention and long-term planning. The media coverage of the tragedy was extensive and often sensationalized, with national news outlets focusing on the dramatic aspects of the story rather than the underlying environmental and management issues that had made such an attack possible. Headlines like "Monster Bear Kills Cops" and "Grizzly Terror in Montana" missed the more complex reality of an ecological system under severe stress. Local media coverage was more nuanced, recognizing the dedicated service of Officers Cooper and Wright, while also addressing the broader environmental issues that had contributed to the tragedy. Both officers were posthumously awarded the Montana Medal of Honor for their service and sacrifice in protecting rural communities under extraordinarily dangerous conditions. The families of both officers filed wrongful death lawsuits against multiple agencies, alleging inadequate training, insufficient equipment, and failure to provide adequate warning about the dangers posed by Bear 211. The legal proceedings would continue for more than 3 years, ultimately resulting in settlements that established new protocols for officer safety in wildlife-prone areas. Dr. Catherine Phillips faced intense scrutiny for her department's handling of Bear 211's case, particularly the decision not to remove him from the population despite his documented aggressive behavior and livestock kills. Internal investigations revealed communication failures between different agencies and inadequate protocols for managing bears that showed escalating aggressive behavior. The psychological impact on the law enforcement community was severe and long-lasting. Officers throughout the region reported increased anxiety about wildlife encounters, and many requested transfers to urban assignments where such threats were not part of their daily reality. The Montana Highway Patrol implemented enhanced training programs and upgraded equipment standards for officers working in remote areas. The investigation revealed that Bear 211's collar failure had eliminated crucial monitoring data during the critical period leading up to the attack. New collar technologies were immediately implemented to provide redundant tracking systems and automated alerts when animals moved into areas of human activity. Dispatcher Sarah Chen, who had been the last person to speak with officers Cooper and Wright, required extended psychological counseling to deal with the trauma of the incident. Her detailed logs of the communication attempts provided valuable timeline information for investigators, but the knowledge that she had been talking to the officers just hours before their deaths was devastating. The storm that had provided cover for Bear 211's approach was later determined to be one of the most severe on record for the region, with wind gusts exceeding 70 miles per hour and lightning strikes that disrupted communications across a 500-square-mile area. Meteorological analysis confirmed that the officers had followed correct protocols in remaining at the station during the severe weather, making their deaths even more tragic. The Beartooth Remote Police Station was never rebuilt. The site was cleared and converted to a memorial for officers Cooper and Wright, with a simple granite monument marking the location where they had made their final stand against an unprecedented threat. The memorial includes bronze plaques describing their service and the environmental factors that had contributed to the tragedy. The investigation's final report, released 8 months after the attack, included 47 recommendations for preventing similar tragedies in the future. These ranged from enhanced training and equipment for law enforcement personnel to improved wildlife management protocols and better coordination between agencies responsible for public safety in wilderness areas. Bear management policies throughout the northwestern United States were revised based on lessons learned from the investigation. New protocols required immediate removal of any bear showing predatory behavior toward humans, regardless of other considerations. Enhanced monitoring systems were implemented to track bear movements and behavior patterns with greater precision and reliability. The drought conditions that had contributed to Bear 211's behavioral changes persisted for another 14 months after the attack, leading to additional wildlife-human conflicts throughout the region. However, the enhanced management protocols and increased awareness prevented any repetition of the predatory behavior that had made Bear 211 so dangerous. Climate change research was accelerated following the investigation, as scientists recognized the connection between changing environmental conditions and increased wildlife-human conflicts. Funding was increased for studies examining how drought, habitat loss, and food scarcity affected large predator behavior and population dynamics. The families of Officers Cooper and Wright established a foundation dedicated to supporting law enforcement personnel working in remote areas and advancing research into wildlife-human conflict prevention. The foundation provides scholarships for training programs and funds research into better equipment and protocols for officers facing wildlife threats. Thomas Mackenzie, whose track identification had provided the first warning of Bear 211's presence in the area, became an advocate for improved communication between wildlife managers and rural residents. His detailed knowledge of local animal behavior patterns was formally incorporated into monitoring protocols for the region. 5 years after the tragedy, the debate continues over whether the deaths of Officers Cooper and Wright could have been prevented. The investigation revealed multiple decision points where different choices might have changed the outcome, but also demonstrated the limitations of human preparation when facing the unpredictable consequences of environmental stress on large predator behavior. The memorial service for Officers Brian Cooper and Melissa Wright was attended by more than 2,000 people, including law enforcement personnel from across the United States and wildlife managers from around the world. Their deaths had become a symbol of the challenges facing those who work to protect people in environments where humans are not the dominant predators. The investigation's findings contributed to a broader understanding of how climate change and environmental stress could affect wildlife behavior in ways that created new threats to human safety. Research programs were established at universities across North America to study these connections and develop better strategies for managing human-wildlife interactions in a changing environment. Bear 211's remains were preserved for scientific study, with tissue samples distributed to research institutions around the world. Analysis of his genetics, hormone levels, and brain chemistry contributed to understanding how environmental stress could alter behavior patterns in large predators. The research derived from his case would influence wildlife management policies for decades to come. The August 5, 2025, attack at the Beartooth Remote Police Station represented a watershed moment in the understanding of human-wildlife conflicts in North America. The deaths of Officers Cooper and Wright served as a tragic reminder that the boundary between civilization and wilderness remains fragile, and that changing environmental conditions could create threats that exceeded traditional preparation and training. The story of Bear 211 and the officers who died trying to stop him became a case study taught in law enforcement academies, wildlife management programs, and emergency response training courses around the world. Their sacrifice contributed to better understanding and preparation that would protect countless others facing similar threats in the changing landscape of human-wildlife interaction. In the years following the tragedy, the lessons learned from the investigation were incorporated into training programs and management protocols across North America. The deaths of Brian Cooper and Melissa Wright were not in vain. Their sacrifice led to changes that made similar tragedies less likely and better prepared others to face the evolving challenges of protecting people in wilderness environments. The final entry in the investigation report concluded, "The deaths of Officers Cooper and Wright resulted from an unprecedented combination of environmental stress, wildlife behavior modification, and extreme weather conditions that exceeded existing protocols and training. While their deaths represent a tragic loss, the lessons learned from this incident have contributed to enhanced safety measures and improved understanding that will protect others facing similar threats in the future." The Beartooth Remote Police Station tragedy remains the only documented case of a grizzly bear demonstrating tactical hunting behavior toward law enforcement personnel. The investigation's findings continue to influence wildlife management policies and law enforcement training programs more than 5 years after the deaths of Officers Cooper and Wright, ensuring that their sacrifice continues to protect others, working to safeguard remote communities throughout North America. The next stories, March 16, 2025. 900-pound Grizzly destroys police cruiser, leaves 2 officers critical in Wyoming. The wind howled across the high desert plateau of Fremont County, Wyoming, carrying with it the scent of sage and the lingering promise of winter's final breath. Sergeant Thomas James Reed, 41 years old and a 17-year veteran of the Fremont County Sheriff's Department, adjusted his grip on the steering wheel of Patrol Unit 47 as he navigated the winding gravel road that led toward the remote wilderness area 15 miles northwest of Dubois. The Crown Victoria's suspension groaned under the weight of emergency equipment as it bounced over the washboard surface, each jarring impact sending a familiar ache through Reed's lower back, where shrapnel from his tour in Afghanistan had left its permanent reminder. Deputy Samuel Antonio Ortiz, 35, sat in the passenger seat, his dark eyes scanning the tree line that pressed close to the narrow road on both sides. A 12-year veteran of law enforcement who had transferred to Fremont County from Denver 3 years earlier, seeking the quieter pace of rural policing, Ortiz found himself increasingly uneasy about this particular call. The dispatcher's voice had been tense when she'd relayed the report of missing hikers in the area known locally as Bear Creek Canyon. And Ortiz had worked enough missing persons cases to know that when people disappeared in grizzly country, the outcomes were rarely favorable. The radio crackled with static as they climbed higher into the foothills of the Absaroka Range, the towering peaks of the Continental Divide visible in the distance through breaks in the pine and aspen forest. Reed reached forward and adjusted the volume, catching fragments of chatter from other units spread across the county's 9,266 square miles of largely unpopulated wilderness. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the canyon walls that rose steeply on either side of their route, and both officers knew they had perhaps 2 hours of good light remaining before darkness would force them to suspend the search until morning. The missing hikers were Jennifer Lynn Morrison, 28, a wildlife biology graduate student from the University of Wyoming, and her fiancé Marcus Daniel Chen, 31, a software engineer from Laramie who had planned this backcountry excursion as a celebration of Morrison's successful thesis defense on grizzly bear behavioral patterns in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. They had been reported overdue by Morrison's thesis advisor, Dr. Catherine Elizabeth Hawthorne, when they failed to return from their planned 3-day trek and missed Morrison's scheduled presentation to the university's wildlife management program. Their vehicle, a red Toyota 4Runner with Colorado plates, had been located that morning in the parking area at the Bear Creek Trailhead by Park Ranger Daniel Dutch Vanderberg, a 26-year veteran of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department who had been conducting routine patrol of the area. Reed downshifted as the patrol car climbed a particularly steep section of the access road, the engine laboring in the thin air at 7,800 feet elevation. He had worked these mountains for nearly 2 decades, first as a deputy and then as a sergeant, and he knew their moods and dangers as well as any man could. The grizzly population in this region had been steadily increasing since the species protection under the Endangered Species Act, and encounters between bears and humans had become increasingly common as recreational use of the backcountry expanded. Just the previous month, a bow hunter named Robert James Sullivan had been mauled near Togwotee Pass, suffering severe lacerations to his face and arms before managing to reach his truck and drive himself to the hospital in Jackson. The incident had sent ripples of concern through the local law enforcement community, as bear attacks on humans had historically been rare in this part of Wyoming. Ortiz checked his watch and noted the time. 3:47 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. The late winter weather had been unusually warm for mid-March, with daytime temperatures reaching into the low 50s and nighttime lows hovering just below freezing. This weather pattern had created dangerous conditions in the high country, where sudden temperature swings could trigger avalanches and where bears emerging from winter hibernation might be more aggressive than usual as they sought to replenish their depleted fat reserves. The deputy pulled out his notebook and reviewed the timeline they had established based on the missing couple's planned itinerary and the last confirmed sighting. March 13th, 2:30 p.m. Morrison and Chen had signed the trail register at the Bear Creek trailhead, indicating their intention to hike the 12-mile loop trail that would take them to Grizzly Lake and back over a 3-day period. The trail was considered moderately difficult, with an elevation gain of 2,400 feet through dense forest and across several creek crossings that could become treacherous during spring runoff. March 13th. Evening. According to their planned schedule, the couple should have reached their first campsite at Bear Creek Meadows, approximately 4 miles from the trailhead, where they intended to spend their first night. March 14th. Their plan called for hiking the remaining 8 miles to Grizzly Lake, setting up camp near the lake's outlet and spending the day photographing wildlife and collecting data for Morrison's research on grizzly bear habitat usage. March 15th. They should have broken camp and returned to the trailhead via the same route, arriving at their vehicle by late afternoon. March 16th, 8 a.m. When Morrison failed to appear for her scheduled thesis presentation, Dr. Hawthorne had contacted campus security, who in turn notified the Fremont County Sheriff's Department. The patrol car crested a ridge, and the Bear Creek trailhead came into view below them, a small gravel parking area carved from the forest where the red Toyota 4Runner sat alone under the towering pines. Reed pulled up beside the vehicle, and both officers stepped out into the cool mountain air, their breath visible in small puffs as they surveyed the scene. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pine boughs and the distant call of a Clark's nutcracker somewhere in the canopy above. Ranger Vanderberg emerged from the tree line, his weathered face grim beneath the brim of his campaign hat. At 57 years old, Vanderberg had seen more wilderness tragedies than any man should have to endure, from fatal falls to hypothermia victims to the occasional bear mauling that reminded everyone who ventured into these mountains exactly who ruled this domain. His radio crackled as he approached the 2 officers, and he paused to acknowledge a status check from the search and rescue coordinator back at the County Emergency Operations Center. "Tom, Sam," Vanderberg nodded to the officers as he joined them beside the 4Runner. "I've been up about 3 miles on the main trail. Found some tracks that might be theirs, but the trail gets pretty churned up this time of year with all the snowmelt and runoff. There's something else, though." He paused and gestured toward the forest. Fresh grizzly sign all over the place up there. Big boar, from the size of the tracks. And I mean fresh, probably within the last day or 2. Reed felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever bear encounters entered the equation. He had been present at 2 fatal maulings during his career, and the images of what a grizzly could do to the human body were permanently etched in his memory. The first had been an elk hunter named Michael Torres, who had stumbled into a sow with cubs near Dubois in 2019. By the time Reed and his partner had reached the scene, there had been little left to recover. The second incident had involved a young couple from California who had ignored posted warnings and ventured into a known bear habitat area with inadequate precautions. That scene had been even worse, if such a thing was possible. "What kind of sign?" Ortiz asked, pulling out his field notebook to document the ranger's observations. "Scat, claw marks on trees, diggings where he's been after ground squirrels or maybe cached meat. This bear's been active in the area for at least a week, maybe longer. The tracks I found were made sometime yesterday, judging by how the edges have weathered. Vanderberg removed his hat and ran his fingers through his greying hair. There's something else that's got me worried. I found what looks like human gear scattered about half a mile up the trail. A water bottle, some torn fabric that might be from a backpack. Could be from our missing hikers, could be from someone else, but either way it doesn't look good. The three men stood in silence for a moment, each contemplating the implications of what they were facing. Reed knew from experience that when people went missing in grizzly country, every hour that passed reduced the chances of a successful rescue. If Morrison and Chen had encountered the bear that Vanderberg was tracking, time was working against them in ways that went far beyond simple exposure to the elements. A new voice crackled over the radio as Search and Rescue Coordinator Lieutenant Patricia Ann Kowalski checked in from the command post she had established at the fire station in Dubois. Unit 47, what's your status at the trailhead? Reed keyed his microphone. Unit 47 to command, we're on scene with Ranger Vanderberg. We have fresh grizzly sign in the area and possible human debris on the trail. Request additional units and the K-9 team if available. Copy that, Unit 47. Be advised that weather is forecasting possible snow showers after sunset with temperatures dropping into the 20s. We've got search and rescue teams staged and ready to deploy, but we need daylight for helicopter operations if this escalates. Ortiz checked his equipment belt, ensuring his bear spray was readily accessible alongside his service weapon. He knew from his training that firearms were often ineffective against charging grizzlies, particularly large boars that could weigh upward of 600 pounds and move with surprising speed despite their bulk. The pepper spray, while not foolproof, had proven more reliable at stopping aggressive bears in numerous documented encounters throughout the northwestern United States. Vanderberg led them to the trail register, a weathered metal box mounted on a post at the beginning of the hiking trail. Inside, a logbook documented the comings and goings of wilderness visitors, and he flipped through the pages until he found the entry from March 13th. Morrison's handwriting was neat and precise, indicating their planned route and expected return date. Vanderberg pointed to other entries from the preceding days, noting that several other hiking parties had used the trail recently, including a group of University of Wyoming geology students who had completed the loop on March 11th without incident. The concerning thing, Vanderberg explained, is that this trail sees pretty regular use this time of year, especially on weekends. If Morrison and Chen ran into trouble early in their hike, we should have heard about it from other hikers by now. The fact that nobody's reported anything suggests either they made it deeper into the backcountry before encountering problems, or... He left the sentence unfinished, but all three men understood the implication. Reed studied the topographic map that Vanderberg had spread across the hood of the patrol car, tracing the route with his finger and noting the elevation contours and geographic features. The trail followed Bear Creek upstream for approximately 6 miles before climbing steeply toward Grizzly Lake, which sat in a cirque at 9,200 feet elevation, surrounded by towering granite peaks. The terrain was rugged and unforgiving, with numerous opportunities for hikers to become lost or injured, particularly if weather conditions deteriorated unexpectedly. If they made it to the lake, Reed observed, and something happened there, it could be days before we find them. That area's completely cut off once the snow starts falling, and with these temperature swings we've been having, conditions up there could change fast. Vanderberg nodded grimly. That's exactly what I'm worried about. I've been monitoring weather patterns all week, and we're looking at a significant temperature drop tonight. If they're injured and can't maintain body heat... Again, he didn't need to finish the thought. The radio suddenly came alive with urgent chatter as additional units reported their positions and deployment status. Deputy Maria Elena Santos, 39, a 9-year veteran who served as the department's canine handler, was en route with Rex, a German shepherd trained in search and rescue operations. Emergency medical technician James Robert Mitchell, 44, was standing by with the county's ambulance at the fire station, ready to respond if victims were located. Search and rescue volunteers from 3 different counties were being mobilized, including experienced mountaineers and wilderness medics who could operate in the challenging terrain around Grizzly Lake. Ortiz felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders as he considered the multiple scenarios they might be facing. Best case, Morrison and Chen had simply gotten lost or delayed and would walk out on their own within the next few hours. More likely, they had encountered some form of trouble, injury, equipment failure, or environmental emergency that had prevented them from returning as scheduled. Worst case, they had fallen victim to the grizzly bear, whose presence was becoming increasingly evident as Vanderberg continued to point out sign along the trail. The afternoon sun continued its relentless descent toward the western peaks, and Reed made the decision to begin a preliminary reconnaissance of the trail while sufficient daylight remained. "Dutch, I want you to lead Sam and me up the first couple miles of trail. We'll document anything we find and establish a baseline for the search teams when they arrive. If we encounter fresh bear sign or evidence of the missing hikers, we'll reassess our approach." Vanderberg shouldered his pack, which contained emergency medical supplies, additional bear spray, and flares for signaling aircraft. His radio crackled as he reported their intentions to the command post, receiving acknowledgement from Lieutenant Kowalski and instructions to maintain regular contact as they proceeded into the wilderness area. The 3 men set off up the trail at 4:15 p.m., their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of pine needles and decomposing leaves that carpeted the forest floor. Reed took point, his hand resting on the grip of his service weapon, despite knowing that it would likely prove inadequate against a charging grizzly. Ortiz followed 10 feet behind, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest for movement or sign of the missing hikers. Vanderberg brought up the rear, his experienced eyes reading the wilderness like a book, noting the subtle indicators that told the story of who and what had passed this way before them. The trail initially followed a gentle grade alongside Bear Creek, where the sound of rushing water provided a constant backdrop to their progress. The creek was running high with snowmelt from the higher elevations, and several small waterfalls cascaded down the steep canyon walls, creating pools of ice-cold water that reflected the towering pines above. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scents of pine resin, wet earth, and the faint musk that might have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but could just as well have been bear scent, but easily have been the natural odors of the forest. After approximately 20 minutes of hiking, Vanderberg called a halt and pointed to a large ponderosa pine about 50 yards ahead. "That's where I found the first fresh claw marks," he said, leading them closer to examine the tree. The bark had been stripped away in parallel gouges that extended from about 4 feet above the ground to nearly 8 feet, indicating a bear of considerable size. The wounds in the bark were recent, with sap still weeping from the deepest cuts. Reed photographed the claw marks with his cell phone, noting the GPS coordinates for future reference. The gouges were deep and wide, suggesting claws of unusual length and strength. He had seen bear claw marks before, but these seemed more extensive than what he would have expected from even a large black bear. "This is definitely grizzly," he observed, measuring the distance between individual claw marks with a small ruler from his equipment belt. "No question about it," Vanderberg confirmed. Black bears don't make marks like this, and the spacing between the claws indicates a front paw that's probably 8 or 9 inches wide. We're looking at a big boar, probably in the 400 to 600 pound range, maybe bigger. Ortiz felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air as he considered the implications of encountering such an animal in the wilderness. He had read numerous accounts of grizzly attacks during his training, and he knew that bears of this size possessed the strength to break human bones with casual swipes of their massive paws. The thought of Morrison and Chen, likely carrying minimal defensive equipment, encountering such a creature in the wilderness sent a wave of anxiety through his chest. They continued up the trail, finding additional sign every few hundred yards. Scat piles that were unmistakably grisly, containing the partially digested remains of berries, roots, and what appeared to be small mammal fur. Overturned logs where the bear had been foraging for insects and grubs. More claw marks on trees, some fresh and some older, suggesting that this particular animal had been using this territory for an extended period. At the 1-mile mark, Vanderberg discovered what he had mentioned earlier, scattered human debris that immediately caught the attention of all 3 men. A blue Nalgene water bottle lay beside the trail, its cap missing and the bottle partially crushed, as if it had been stepped on by something heavy. Nearby, strips of what appeared to be nylon fabric from a backpack or tent were caught on low-hanging branches, fluttering in the breeze like prayer flags. Reed documented the scene carefully, photographing each piece of debris from multiple angles before bagging the items as potential evidence. The water bottle bore no immediately visible identifying marks, but the fabric was clearly from high-quality outdoor gear of the type that serious backcountry hikers would carry. More concerning was the way the items were scattered, suggesting they had been scattered by force rather than simply dropped or discarded. "This doesn't look good," Ortiz murmured as he examined the scene. If this gear belonged to Morrison and Chen, something caused them to lose it involuntarily. People don't just drop their water bottles in grizzly country unless something's seriously wrong. Vanderberg knelt beside the trail and pointed to depressions in the soft earth that might have been footprints, though the constant traffic of hikers and the effects of recent snowmelt had obscured most clear tracks. "I'm seeing what might be human prints here, but they're too degraded to be certain. The concerning thing is that I'm not seeing a clear trail where someone walked back down toward the trailhead. Either they continued deeper into the backcountry or—" He stood and gestured toward the dense forest that surrounded them on all sides. The radio on Reed's belt crackled with an update from the command post. "Unit 47, be advised that the K9 team is approximately 15 minutes from your location. Search and rescue teams are staged and ready to deploy on your recommendation. What's your assessment of the situation?" Reed keyed his microphone, weighing his response carefully. "Command, we have multiple indicators of recent grizzly activity in the immediate area, including fresh claw marks and scat. We've also located what appears to be scattered human gear approximately 1 mile up the trail. Recommend deploying additional teams, but with extreme caution due to bear activity. We're going to continue reconnaissance for another half-mile and then reassess. Copy, Unit 47. Be advised that air support is on standby at the Jackson Airport, but we'll be losing light for helicopter operations within 90 minutes. Keep us informed of any developments." The 3 men continued up the trail, their senses heightened by the growing evidence that something had gone seriously wrong in this section of wilderness. The forest seemed to close in around them as they climbed higher, the canopy becoming denser and the undergrowth thicker. The sound of Bear Creek provided a constant backdrop, but even that seemed muted and distant as they penetrated deeper into the backcountry. At the 1.5-mile mark, they encountered something that stopped them in their tracks. The trail ahead was blocked by what appeared to be a large fallen log, but as they approached, Vanderberg held up his hand in warning. "That's not a fallen tree," he said quietly. "That's a cache." The three men approached carefully, and Reed felt his stomach tighten as he realized what they were looking at. A grizzly bear had constructed a cache by piling logs, branches, and forest debris over what was clearly a large carcass, probably an elk or deer that the bear had killed or scavenged. The cache was recent, with the vegetation still green on many of the branches, and the distinctive musky odor of bear scent was overwhelming in the immediate area. "This is extremely dangerous," Vanderberg said in a low voice. "Grizzlies are incredibly protective of their food caches, and this one's fresh. If the bear is anywhere in the area, it'll defend this aggressively." He gestured for them to back away slowly, his hand moving to the bear spray on his belt. Reed felt the hair on the back of his neck standing up as he scanned the surrounding forest, suddenly aware of how vulnerable they were in this remote location. The dense undergrowth could easily conceal a charging grizzly until it was too late to react, and their position on the narrow trail left little room for evasive maneuver. He keyed his radio to report their discovery to the command post, keeping his voice low to avoid attracting attention from any wildlife that might be monitoring their movement. "Command, Unit 47. We've located a fresh grizzly cache approximately 1.5 miles up the trail. This significantly increases the danger level for search operations in this area. The bear will likely be defending this cache aggressively." Lieutenant Kowalski's voice crackled back immediately. "Copy, Unit 47. Are you able to continue your reconnaissance safely?" Reed looked at Vanderberg, who shook his head grimly. "I don't recommend going any further without additional personnel and equipment. This bear is clearly active in the immediate area, and with a fresh cache to defend, it's going to be extremely aggressive toward any perceived threats." Before Reed could relay this assessment to the command post, Ortiz suddenly grabbed his arm and pointed toward the forest to their left. "Movement!" he whispered urgently. "Something big, about 50 yards out." All three men froze, their eyes straining to penetrate the shadows beneath the pine canopy. For several long seconds, there was nothing but the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant sound of rushing water. Then Vanderberg spotted it, a massive dark shape moving slowly through the undergrowth, partially obscured by the thick vegetation but clearly visible to anyone who knew what to look for. "Grizzly!" Vanderberg breathed, his hand moving slowly toward his bear spray. "Big boar, and he's seen us." The bear was enormous, its shoulder hump clearly visible even at a distance as it moved through the forest with the deliberate gait that characterized its species. Reed estimated the animal's weight at well over 500 pounds, possibly approaching 600. Making it one of the largest grizzlies he had ever encountered in nearly 2 decades of wilderness law enforcement. The bear's coat was dark brown, almost black in places, with the distinctive silver-tipped guard hairs that gave grizzlies their name. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than 30 seconds, the bear and the three men regarded each other across the forest clearing. The animal showed no immediate signs of aggression, but neither did it show any inclination to retreat. Instead, it simply stood in the shadows, its massive head turned toward them, clearly assessing the situation and determining whether these intruders represented a threat to its territory or its cache. Reed slowly reached for his radio, moving with infinite care to avoid triggering a charge from the massive predator. "Command," he whispered into the microphone, "we have visual contact with a large grizzly bear approximately 50 yards from our position. The animal appears to be monitoring our movement. We're going to back away slowly and return to the trailhead." The response from Lieutenant Kowalski was immediate and tense. "Copy, Unit 47. All units be advised that officers are in close proximity to an active grizzly bear. Air support is being scrambled immediately." Vanderberg gestured for the two officers to begin backing down the trail, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid triggering the bear's predatory instincts. Reed had been trained in bear encounter protocols during his wilderness law enforcement certification, and he knew that sudden movements or attempts to run could transform what was currently a standoff into a deadly chase. Grizzly bears could reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour in short bursts, making escape on foot virtually impossible in the dense forest terrain. They had backed approximately 20 yards down the trail when the bear suddenly stood up on its hind legs, rising to a height of nearly 8 feet as it attempted to get a better view of the retreating humans. The sight was simultaneously magnificent and terrifying, showcasing the raw power and size of one of North America's apex predators. Reed felt his mouth go dry as he realized that this animal possessed the strength to kill all 3 of them with casual ease if it chose to attack. "Keep moving," Vanderberg whispered urgently. "Don't make eye contact, don't run, but don't stop moving away from the cache area." The bear dropped back to all fours and began moving parallel to their retreat, staying in the tree line, but clearly tracking their movement. This behavior was particularly concerning to Vanderberg, who had observed hundreds of bear encounters during his career with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. Most bears, when discovered by humans, would either flee immediately or display aggressive behavior to drive the intruders away. This animal was doing neither, instead following them with what appeared to be calculated interest. They continued their slow retreat for another quarter-mile before the bear finally disappeared into the dense undergrowth, though Vanderberg cautioned that the animal might still be following them at a distance. The tension in Reed's shoulders didn't begin to ease until they had put significant distance between themselves and the cache site. And even then he remained acutely aware that they were operating in the grizzlies' territory, not their own. At 5:20 p.m., they reached the trailhead where Deputy Santos and her German Shepherd Rex had arrived and were waiting for their report. Santos, a compact woman with prematurely grey hair and intense dark eyes, had served as the department's K-9 handler for 6 years and had participated in dozens of search and rescue operations throughout the mountainous regions of Wyoming. Rex, a 5-year-old German Shepherd with extensive training in wilderness search operations, immediately began showing interest in the scents the 3 men had brought back from their reconnaissance. "What did you find up there?" Santos asked as she secured Rex's tracking harness and prepared her equipment for a potential search deployment. Reed provided a detailed briefing on their discoveries, emphasizing the fresh grizzly cache and their close encounter with what appeared to be an exceptionally large boar. Santos listened intently, occasionally asking questions about the bear's behavior and the condition of the scattered human debris they had discovered. "Rex is definitely picking up something," Santos observed, as her dog continued to work the scents around the patrol car and trailhead area. "He's indicating human scent, but he's also showing stress behaviors that usually mean predator activity." Vanderberg examined Rex's body language, noting the dog's raised hackles and the way he kept looking toward the forest with obvious unease. Dogs can sense bear scent from considerable distances, and they instinctively recognize grizzlies as a serious threat. If Rex is showing stress, it confirms what we observed up there. The radio crackled with updates from the command post as additional resources arrived in the area. Lieutenant Kowalski reported that a Wyoming Highway Patrol helicopter was en route from Jackson and would be available for aerial reconnaissance of the upper portions of the trail system where ground teams could not safely operate in the presence of an aggressive grizzly. Emergency medical personnel were staging at the fire station in Dubois, and specialized wilderness rescue teams from Teton County were en route with equipment for potential overnight operations. Reed studied the topographic map again, tracing possible routes that Morrison and Chen might have taken if they had encountered the grizzly near the cache site. The trail beyond that point continued to climb steeply toward Grizzly Lake, but there were several side trails and game paths that could lead deeper into the wilderness if the hikers had been forced to deviate from their planned route. If they encountered that bear near the cache, Reed speculated, they might have tried to circle around it using one of the game trails. That could put them anywhere in a several square mile area, depending on how far they got off the main trail. Santos nodded, considering the implications for search operations. Rex can track human scent for miles if the conditions are right, but with all the bear activity in the area, I'm not comfortable taking him very far from support. If we encounter that grizzly, even Rex won't be able to help us. The approaching sunset painted the western peaks in shades of orange and pink, a beautiful sight that was rendered ominous by the knowledge that darkness would soon make search operations extremely dangerous. Night operations in grizzly habitat were generally considered too risky for ground teams, particularly when dealing with a bear that had already demonstrated aggressive territorial behavior. Lieutenant Kowalski's voice crackled over the radio with a status update. All units, be advised that Weather Services is updating their forecast. We're now looking at possible snow showers beginning around midnight, with accumulations of 2 to 4 inches above 8,000 feet elevation. Temperatures will drop into the teens overnight. This significantly impacts our operational timeline if we have injured persons in the backcountry. Reed felt the weight of command responsibility settling on his shoulders as he considered their options. Every instinct told him that Morrison and Chen were in serious trouble, possibly injured or trapped somewhere in the wilderness above them. The scattered debris they had found suggested a violent encounter, and the presence of the aggressive grizzly made rescue operations extremely hazardous. Yet he also knew that exposure to overnight temperatures in the teens could be fatal for anyone who was injured and unable to maintain adequate body heat. Maria, how confident are you that Rex can track human scent in these conditions? Reed asked Santos as he weighed the risks of deploying search teams into known grizzly habitat with darkness approaching. Santos knelt beside her dog and ran her hands through his thick coat, feeling the tension in his muscles. He's a good tracker, and the conditions aren't terrible for scent work. The problem is that he's already showing stress about the bear activity, and that's going to affect his ability to concentrate on human scent. If we encounter that grizzly, Rex's training is to alert and retreat, not to engage. Vanderberg checked his watch and calculated the remaining daylight. We've got maybe 45 minutes of good light left, maybe an hour if we push it. The helicopter should be here within 20 minutes, and they can cover a lot more ground than we can on foot. My recommendation is to wait for air support and see what they can observe from above before we commit ground teams. The radio suddenly erupted with urgent chatter as the Wyoming Highway Patrol helicopter checked in with the command post. Fremont County Command, this is Air Rescue 12, approximately 5 minutes from your location. Request briefing on search parameters and hazard information. Lieutenant Kowalski coordinated the response. Air Rescue 12, be advised you have 2 missing hikers. Last known position approximately 4 miles northeast of Bear Creek Trailhead. Ground teams have confirmed fresh grizzly activity, including a defensive cache site. Missing persons may be injured and off-trail, weather deteriorating with snow forecast after midnight. Reed looked up as the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the canyon, growing louder as the aircraft approached their position. The Wyoming Highway Patrol Bell 407 appeared above the tree line, its pilot expertly maneuvering the aircraft to avoid the mountain downdrafts that could make flying treacherous in this terrain. The helicopter settled into a hover above the trailhead parking area, its rotor wash stirring up dust and pine needles as the crew conducted their initial assessment of the area. Pilot Captain Janet Louise Reeves, a 23-year veteran of law enforcement aviation with extensive experience in wilderness search and rescue operations, established radio contact with the ground teams. Ground units, this is Air Rescue 12. We have good visibility and approximately 45 minutes of operational light remaining. Request permission to begin aerial reconnaissance of the trail system. Reed coordinated with Lieutenant Kowalski to approve the air search, providing GPS coordinates for the Grizzly cache location and emphasizing the extreme danger posed by the bear's presence in the search area. Captain Reeves acknowledged the briefing and began her systematic aerial survey of the Bear Creek Trail system, using the helicopter's powerful searchlight to penetrate the forest canopy where possible. The aircraft followed the trail system northeast from the trailhead, maintaining sufficient altitude to avoid disturbing wildlife while providing the crew with clear observation of the terrain below. Flight Officer Sergeant Robert Bobby Martinez, who served as the helicopter's tactical flight officer and rescue specialist, operated the aircraft's thermal imaging system to search for heat signatures that might indicate human presence in the wilderness. "Ground units, Air Rescue 12. Captain Reeves's voice crackled over the radio after 10 minutes of searching. "We're observing significant wildlife activity in the area, approximately 2 miles northeast of your position. Large thermal signature consistent with bear activity and what appears to be disturbed ground around the cache site your team's identified." Reed felt his pulse quicken as he listened to the air crew's reports. "Air Rescue U-12, any indication of human activity or distress signals in the area?" "Negative on distress signals, but we're seeing some debris scattered in the forest approximately half a mile northeast of the cache site. Looks like camping gear or backpack content spread over a fairly wide area. We're going to circle back for a closer look." Santos felt Rex suddenly become alert. His ears perked forward as he stared intently toward the northeast. The dog's body language indicated he was picking up scent information that had captured his full attention, and Santos knew from experience that this usually meant human scent was present in significant concentrations. "Rex is alerting," Santos reported to Reed. "He's picking up something from the direction the helicopter is searching." Vanderberg studied the topographic map, tracing the terrain features in the area where the aircrew was reporting debris. If Morrison and Chen encountered the bear near the cache and tried to escape cross-country, they could have ended up in that drainage. It's rough terrain, lots of deadfall and steep slopes where someone could easily get injured. The radio crackled again as Captain Reeves provided an update on their aerial observations. "Ground units, we're definitely seeing scattered camping gear in the forest, but no immediate signs of human presence. The debris field is extensive, suggesting either an animal encounter or severe weather event. We're going to expand our search pattern to cover the adjacent drainage systems." Reed made the decision to deploy Santos and Rex on a limited tracking mission, while the helicopter provided overhead support and protection. The combination of the dog's ground-level scent detection capabilities and the aircraft's aerial observation platform would give them the best chance of locating Morrison and Chen before darkness made further operations impossible. "Maria, I want you and Rex to track northeast from the trailhead toward the debris field the helicopter spotted. Dutch and I will follow at a distance to provide backup. If Rex alerts on anything, or if we encounter the bear, we retreat immediately." Santos nodded and began preparing Rex for deployment, checking his protective vest and ensuring his radio collar was functioning properly. The specialized collar would allow the command post to track the dog's location and receive alerts if he encountered danger during the search operation. At 5:45 p.m., the tracking team moved out from the trailhead, with Rex immediately picking up scent trails that led away from the established hiking path. The dog's behavior indicated strong human scent, and Santos felt cautiously optimistic that they were on the right trail as they moved through the forest toward the area where the helicopter had spotted scattered debris. The terrain became increasingly difficult as they left the maintained trail, with fallen logs, steep slopes, and dense undergrowth slowing their progress significantly. Reed found himself grateful for his military training as he navigated the challenging terrain, though he was acutely aware that his 41-year-old body was not as resilient as it had been during his army days. After 20 minutes of difficult tracking, Rex suddenly stopped and began displaying the alert behavior that indicated he had found something significant. Santos called for the team to halt while she assessed her dog's body language and attempted to determine what had captured his attention. "He's found something," Santos called softly to Reed and Vanderberg. "Human scent, definitely, but he's also showing stress indicators. Could be bear scent mixed in." They approached Rex's position carefully and immediately saw what had triggered the dog's alert. A blue backpack was caught in the branches of a large pine tree, about 8 feet off the ground, apparently thrown there with considerable force. The pack was partially shredded, with gear spilling from tears in the fabric and scattered across the forest floor below. Reed felt his heart sink as he recognized the type of equipment scattered around the base of the tree. High-quality camping gear, water purification tablets, first aid supplies, and what appeared to be scientific equipment that would be consistent with Morrison's wildlife research activities. The scene clearly indicated a violent encounter, with gear scattered over an area of approximately 30 yards. Vanderberg examined the base of the pine tree and discovered what he had been dreading. Clear, grisly tracks in the soft earth, along with human footprints that showed signs of running. The story told by the tracks was unmistakable. People had been here, the bear had encountered them, and there had been a violent confrontation. "Command Unit 47, Reed spoke into his radio, his voice tight with concern. "We've located what appears to be the missing hikers' campsite. Extensive evidence of bear activity and human distress. The scene indicates a violent encounter between the bear and the missing persons." Lieutenant Kowalski's response was immediate. "Copy, Unit 47. Air Rescue 12 is en route to your position. Are you seeing any immediate indication of human casualties?" Reed scanned the area carefully, looking for the blood or other biological evidence that would indicate serious injury or death. While the scene clearly showed a violent encounter, he was not immediately seeing the obvious signs of human fatality that would be expected if the bear had killed Morrison and Chen at this location. "No immediate evidence of human casualties at this location," Reed reported. "However, the gear scattered here suggests the encounter forced the missing persons to abandon essential survival equipment." Santos worked with Rex to determine if human scent continued beyond the encounter site, hoping to establish a direction of travel that might lead them to the missing hikers. The dog showed interest in several different scent trails leading away from the debris field, but his behavior remained stressed and uncertain, indicating the presence of overwhelming bear scent that was interfering with his ability to isolate human tracks. The helicopter appeared overhead, its searchlight illuminating the forest floor as Captain Reeves and Sergeant Martinez assessed the scene from above. The powerful light revealed additional details that had not been visible from ground level, including what appeared to be a torn tent and sleeping bag scattered throughout the surrounding forest. "Ground units, from our position we can see that this debris field extends much further than you can observe at ground level," Captain Reeves reported. "Whatever happened here was extensive and violent. We're also seeing fresh disturbance patterns in multiple directions leading away from this site." Vanderberg studied the tracks around the encounter site, using his decades of experience reading wildlife sign to piece together what had occurred. The evidence suggested that Morrison and Chen had been in the process of setting up camp when they encountered the grizzly. The scattered gear and the patterns of disturbance indicated that the bear had thoroughly investigated their campsite, probably destroying their equipment in the process. This is consistent with territorial behavior, Vandenberg explained to Reed and Santos. The bear was probably patrolling its territory when it encountered the campers. Grizzlies will often destroy human equipment to eliminate foreign scents from their territory. Reed felt a growing sense of urgency as he considered the implications of what they were seeing. If Morrison and Chen had been forced to flee this location without their essential gear, they would be facing overnight temperatures in the teens with inadequate protection from the elements. Even if they had avoided serious injury during the bear encounter, exposure could prove fatal within hours. "Maria, can Rex determine which direction they went from here?" Reed asked Santos as she continued to work with her dog around the perimeter of the debris field. Santos shook her head grimly. "There's too much bear scent contaminating the area. Rex is picking up human scent in multiple directions, but he can't isolate a clear trail with all the interference from the bear." The radio crackled with an update from the helicopter crew as they expanded their search pattern to cover the drainage systems leading away from the encounter site. "Ground units, we're seeing what might be additional debris approximately quarter-mile northwest of your position, and there appears to be movement in the forest about half a mile to the east. Could be wildlife, could be humans. We're going to investigate." Reed made the difficult decision to divide his limited personnel to cover multiple search areas while daylight remained. "Dutch, I want you to continue working this site with Maria and Rex. Look for any indication of serious injury or evidence that might tell us more about what happened. I'm going to move toward the area where the helicopter spotted movement." Vandenberg nodded, though his expression showed concern about Reed operating alone in an area with known aggressive grizzly activity. "Tom, you sure you want to go solo? That bear could be anywhere in this area." Reed checked his equipment one final time, ensuring his bear spray was readily accessible and his radio was functioning properly. "We're running out of daylight, and if those people are out there injured, we need to find them fast. The helicopter will provide overwatch for my movement." At 6:15 p.m., Reed set off through the forest toward the area where the helicopter crew had reported possible movement, maintaining radio contact with both the air unit and the ground team as he navigated the increasingly difficult terrain. The forest was becoming darker as the sun disappeared behind the mountain peaks, and Reed knew they had perhaps 30 minutes of usable light remaining. The terrain became increasingly challenging as Reed moved away from the established trail system, with steep slopes covered in deadfall and loose rock that made silent movement impossible. Every step seemed to echo through the forest, and Reed found himself constantly scanning the surrounding trees for any sign of the massive grizzly that had terrorized this area. After 15 minutes of careful movement, Reed heard something that made his blood run cold. Human voices calling for help somewhere ahead of him in the forest. The calls were weak and distant, but unmistakably human, and they seemed to be coming from a ravine system approximately 200 yards northeast of his position. "Command, Unit 47, Reed spoke urgently into his radio. "I have audio contact with what appears to be human distress calls approximately 200 yards northeast of the encounter site. Moving to investigate." The response from Lieutenant Kowalski was immediate. "Copy, Unit 47. Air Rescue 12 is repositioning to provide support for your approach." Reed began moving as quickly as safely possible through the dense forest, following the sound of the voices as they continued to call for help. The calls were becoming more distinct as he approached, and he could now make out at least 2 different voices, one male and one female, consistent with the missing hikers Morrison and Chen. The ravine system opened up before him as he crested a small ridge, and Reed immediately spotted 2 figures huddled together in the bottom of the depression approximately 50 yards below his position. Even in the fading light, he could see that both individuals appeared to be injured, with one person supporting the other as they attempted to signal for help. "Morrison? Chen?" Reed called out as he began carefully descending the steep slope toward the ravine bottom. "This is Sergeant Reed with the Fremont County Sheriff's Department. We're here to help." The response was immediate and filled with relief. "Here! We're here! Jennifer is hurt bad, and we've been trapped down here since yesterday." Reed felt a surge of adrenaline as he realized they had found the missing hikers alive, though clearly in need of immediate medical attention. He keyed his radio to alert the command post and air support of the successful location of the missing persons. "Command, Unit 47, we have located both missing hikers alive in a ravine system approximately quarter-mile northeast of the trailhead. At least one person appears to have serious injuries. Request immediate medical evacuation." As Reed reached the bottom of the ravine, he could see that Jennifer Morrison was in serious condition, with what appeared to be a broken leg and possible head injury. Marcus Chen appeared to be in better condition, but was clearly exhausted and suffering from exposure after spending nearly 24 hours in the cold mountain environment. "What happened to you folks?" Reed asked as he began assessing Morrison's injuries and preparing to provide emergency first aid. Chen's account of their ordeal came out in a rush of words as the stress and relief of rescue overwhelmed him. "We were setting up camp yesterday evening when this massive bear came out of nowhere. It destroyed our campsite, scattered all our gear. Jennifer fell trying to get away from it, and I think she broke her leg. We've been trying to get out of this ravine system all day, but every time we tried to climb out, we could hear the bear moving around above us." Reed felt his stomach tighten as he realized the full implications of their situation. Morrison and Chen had been trapped in the ravine system for nearly 24 hours, with an aggressive grizzly patrolling the area above them and preventing their escape. The fact that they had survived the night with minimal protection from the elements was remarkable, but Morrison's injuries clearly required immediate medical attention. "Air Rescue 12, Unit 47, Reed spoke into his radio as he continued his assessment of Morrison's condition. "I need immediate medical evacuation for a female subject with suspected broken leg and possible head injury, also requesting additional ground support for extraction from a ravine system in difficult terrain." Captain Reeves's voice crackled back over the radio. "Copy, Unit 47. We're assessing landing options, but the ravine system makes direct helicopter extraction extremely difficult. We may need to establish a landing zone and transport the injured party to a pickup point." Reed examined Morrison's leg and confirmed Chen's assessment that she had suffered a serious fracture, probably to her left tibia, during her fall while fleeing from the grizzly. She was conscious, but clearly in significant pain, and Reed was concerned about the possibility of internal injuries from the fall that might not be immediately apparent. "Jennifer, I'm Sergeant Reed. We're going to get you out of here. But I need to know about any other injuries. Did you hit your head when you fell? Any pain in your chest or abdomen?" Morrison's response was weak but coherent. "Hit my head on a rock. Been dizzy ever since. Marcus has been taking care of me, but we couldn't get out of here with the bear up there." Reed began preparing Morrison for transport, using supplies from his first aid kit to stabilize her leg injury and assess her for signs of serious head trauma. The fact that she had remained conscious and coherent for nearly 24 hours was encouraging, but he knew that head injuries could be unpredictable and potentially fatal if not treated properly. The radio crackled with updates from the aircrew as they worked to establish a suitable landing zone for medical evacuation. "Ground units, we've identified a clearing approximately 300 yards southeast of your position that should accommodate helicopter operations. We'll need ground support to transport the injured party to that location." Reed coordinated with Vanderberg and Santos to establish a rescue plan that would safely extract Morrison and Chen from the ravine system without exposing the rescue teams to unnecessary risk from the grizzly that was still active in the area. The helicopter would provide overhead reconnaissance to monitor for bear activity while ground teams moved the injured hiker to the landing zone. "Dutch, Maria, I need you to move to my position with a litter and additional medical supplies," Reed radioed to his teammates. "We've got one serious injury that's going to require careful transport through difficult terrain." As Reed waited for additional support to arrive, he continued to assess both hikers and gather information about their ordeal. Chen provided additional details about their encounter with the grizzly, describing an animal of enormous size that had demonstrated aggressive territorial behavior when it discovered their campsite. "It was huge," Chen explained, his voice still shaky from the traumatic experience. "Probably 8 or 9 feet tall when it stood up on its hind legs. It completely destroyed our campsite, threw our gear around like it weighed nothing. We barely got away when it first showed up, and Jennifer fell during our escape." Reed felt a growing concern about the continuing presence of the aggressive grizzly in the immediate area. The fact that Morrison and Chen had been trapped in the ravine for nearly 24 hours while the bear patrolled above them suggested an unusually persistent and territorial animal that might pose ongoing threats to rescue operations. The sound of approaching footsteps alerted Reed to the arrival of Vanderberg and Santos, who had made their way through the forest, carrying emergency medical equipment and a portable litter for transporting Morrison to the helicopter landing zone. Rex accompanied the rescue team, though his continued stress behaviors indicated that bear scent remained heavy in the area. Vanderberg immediately began assisting Reed with Morrison's medical assessment, while Santos established radio communication with the helicopter crew to coordinate the evacuation timeline. The portable litter would allow them to transport Morrison safely through the difficult terrain, but the process would be slow and would expose the rescue team to potential bear encounter for an extended period. "Air Rescue 12, this is Deputy Santos," she spoke into her radio. "We're preparing to transport one injured party to the landing zone. Estimated time for transport is 20 minutes, given the terrain difficulty. Request continuous overwatch for bear activity during our movement." Captain Reeves acknowledged the request and began establishing an aerial patrol pattern that would provide the ground team with advance warning of any bear movement in their area of operations. The helicopter's powerful searchlight would be critical for illuminating the forest and detecting any wildlife that might threaten the rescue operation. At 6:45 p.m., the rescue team began carefully transporting Morrison through the forest toward the helicopter landing zone, with Reed and Vanderberg carrying the litter while Santos and Chen followed behind with essential equipment. The movement was slow and methodical, with frequent stops to rest and reassess Morrison's condition during the difficult transport. Rex continued to show signs of stress as they moved through the forest, frequently alerting toward areas of dense vegetation where his instincts told him potential threats might be concealed. Santos remained particularly vigilant, knowing that her dog's behavior was often the best early warning system for detecting dangerous wildlife in these conditions. The radio crackled with updates from the helicopter crew as they monitored the rescue team's progress through the forest. "Ground units, we're seeing thermal signatures consistent with large wildlife, approximately 400 yards northwest of your position, moving in your general direction. Maintain caution and be prepared to take defensive action if necessary." Reed felt his pulse quicken as he realized the grizzly was apparently tracking their movement through the forest. The bear's persistence in following human activity was extremely unusual and suggested an animal that had lost its natural fear of humans, making it particularly dangerous to anyone operating in its territory. "Copy, Air Rescue 12, Reed responded as the team continued their careful progress toward the landing zone. "We're maintaining defensive posture and will alert immediately if we have visual contact with the bear." The forest seemed to close in around them as they navigated the increasingly difficult terrain, with the helicopter's searchlight providing intermittent illumination through breaks in the dense canopy. Morrison remained conscious during the transport, though Reed was concerned about her deteriorating condition after nearly 24 hours of exposure to cold temperatures with inadequate protection. After 15 minutes of careful movement through the forest, the rescue team reached the edge of the clearing that the helicopter crew had identified as a suitable landing zone. The open area was approximately 100 yards in diameter, surrounded by towering pines that created a natural amphitheater in the wilderness. Captain Reeves began her approach to the landing zone, expertly maneuvering the aircraft through the challenging mountain air currents. As the helicopter settled into the clearing, emergency medical technician Sarah Louise Patterson, 36, emerged from the aircraft with advanced life support equipment and began her assessment of Morrison's injuries. Patterson had served with the Wyoming Highway Patrol's Air Rescue Division for 8 years and had extensive experience treating trauma patients in wilderness settings. "What's her status?" Patterson asked Reed as she began her examination of Morrison's injuries, focusing particularly on the suspected leg fracture and possible head trauma. Reed provided a detailed briefing on Morrison's condition and the circumstances of her injuries, emphasizing the extended exposure to cold temperatures and the traumatic nature of the bear encounter that had caused her fall. Patterson worked efficiently to stabilize Morrison for transport, starting an intravenous line and administering pain medication while preparing her for the helicopter flight to the regional trauma center. The medical assessment confirmed Reed's initial diagnosis of a compound fracture to Morrison's left tibia, along with a concussion and moderate hypothermia from the prolonged exposure to cold temperatures. While serious, her injuries were not immediately life-threatening, and Patterson was confident that Morrison would make a full recovery with proper medical treatment. "She's stable for transport," Patterson reported to Captain Reeves as she prepared Morrison for loading into the helicopter. "We need to get her to the trauma center in Jackson for surgical repair of the fracture, but her vital signs are good and she's neurologically intact." Chen was also evaluated for exposure-related injuries, though his condition was significantly better than Morrison's due to his ability to remain mobile and generate body heat during their ordeal. He would accompany Morrison to the hospital for evaluation and treatment of minor injuries and exposure, but his prognosis was excellent. As the helicopter prepared for departure, Vandenberg coordinated with the command post to establish security protocols for the continued presence of the aggressive grizzly in the area. The bear's unusual behavior and persistent territorial aggression represented an ongoing threat to anyone operating in this section of wilderness, and wildlife management authorities would need to assess whether intervention was necessary. "Command, this is Vandenberg," the ranger spoke into his radio as the helicopter lifted off with Morrison and Chen aboard. "We need to establish a closure area around the Bear Creek Trail system until wildlife management can assess the threat level posed by this grizzly. The animal's behavior is extremely unusual and represents a significant danger to public safety." Lieutenant Kowalski acknowledged the recommendation and began coordinating with Wyoming Game and Fish Department officials to implement emergency closure of the affected trail system. The aggressive grizzly would be monitored and potentially relocated or destroyed if it continued to demonstrate dangerous behavior toward humans. Reed felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion as he watched the helicopter disappear into the darkening sky, carrying Morrison and Chen to safety. The successful rescue had required coordination between multiple agencies and had exposed rescue personnel to significant risk from an unpredictable and dangerous wild animal. The fact that both hikers had survived their ordeal was remarkable, considering the circumstances of their encounter with one of the most powerful predators in North America. The ground team began their careful return to the trailhead, maintaining defensive positions and constant radio contact with the command post as they navigated through the forest in gathering darkness. The grizzlies' continued presence in the area meant that even the extraction of rescue personnel carried significant risk, and everyone involved was acutely aware that the operation was not complete until all personnel had safely returned to the staging area. At 7:30 p.m., Reed, Vanderberg, and Santos reached the trailhead, where additional law enforcement personnel and wildlife management officials were establishing a security perimeter around the area. The successful rescue had required the efforts of dozens of personnel from multiple agencies, demonstrating the complex challenges involved in wilderness search and rescue operations in predator habitat. As Reed completed his incident reports and prepared for the long drive back to the sheriff's department, he reflected on the events of the afternoon and the narrow margin by which Morrison and Chen had survived their encounter with the massive grizzly. The experience served as a stark reminder of the dangers that existed in Wyoming's wilderness areas and the importance of proper preparation and caution when venturing into territory shared with some of North America's most formidable wildlife. The radio crackled with a final update from the hospital in Jackson, confirming that Morrison and Chen had arrived safely and were receiving appropriate medical care. Morrison would require surgery to repair her fractured leg, but both hikers were expected to make full recoveries from their ordeal. The successful outcome was a testament to their survival skills, the effectiveness of the search and rescue response, and perhaps most importantly, a measure of good fortune that had allowed them to avoid more serious injury during their terrifying encounter with the grizzly bear. However, the story was far from over. The aggressive grizzly remained active in the Bear Creek area, and wildlife management officials would need to make difficult decisions about how to address the ongoing threat to public safety. The bear's unusual behavior and apparent loss of fear toward humans represented a complex challenge that would require careful consideration of both public safety concerns and wildlife conservation principles. 3 days later, on March 19th, Reed found himself back in the Bear Creek area, this time accompanying Wyoming Game and Fish Department officials who were conducting a comprehensive assessment of the grizzly's behavior and territory. The bear had been observed on multiple occasions since the rescue operation, displaying continued aggressive territorial behavior that concerned wildlife management experts. Dr. Margaret Elizabeth Hoffman, 47, a wildlife biologist with 22 years of experience studying grizzly bear behavior, had been called in to evaluate the situation and make recommendations for managing the threat posed by this particular animal. Dr. Hoffman had authored numerous research papers on grizzly bear ecology and had extensive experience dealing with problem bears throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. "This bear's behavior is extremely unusual," Dr. Hoffman explained to Reed as they observed the animal from a safe distance through powerful binoculars. "Most grizzlies that encounter humans will either flee or display aggressive behavior designed to drive the humans away. This animal appears to be actively investigating human presence and defending territory in a way that's more typical of black bears than grizzlies." The bear they were observing was indeed massive, easily weighing 600 pounds or more, with the distinctive shoulder hump and dished face profile that characterized its species. The animal showed no apparent fear of the human observers, instead displaying curiosity and territorial aggression that made it extremely dangerous to anyone who might encounter it in the wilderness. Reed watched the bear through his binoculars and felt the same chill of apprehension he had experienced during the rescue operation. The animal's size and apparent lack of fear made it a potential threat to anyone who ventured into this area. and he understood why wildlife management officials were considering drastic action to address the situation. "What are our options for dealing with this bear?" Reed asked Dr. Hoffman as they continued their observation of the animal's behavior. "Unfortunately, our options are limited," Dr. Hoffman replied grimly. "Relocation is extremely difficult with large male grizzlies, as they typically return to their original territory even when moved hundreds of miles away. The bear's size and aggressive behavior also make it a poor candidate for relocation, as it would likely create similar problems wherever it was moved." The implication of Dr. Hoffman's assessment was clear, though she was reluctant to state it directly. The grizzly's aggressive behavior and apparent habituation to human presence made it an ongoing threat to public safety that might require lethal management action if alternative solutions proved ineffective. Reed understood the complexity of the situation facing wildlife management officials. Grizzly bears were protected under federal law and represented a conservation success story after decades of recovery efforts in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The decision to destroy a healthy adult bear was never made lightly and required extensive justification based on clear threats to public safety. Over the following weeks, Reed continued to monitor the situation in the Bear Creek area as wildlife officials implemented various strategies to modify the bear's behavior and reduce the threat to public safety. The trail system remained closed to public access, and warning signs were posted throughout the area, alerting visitors to the presence of an aggressive grizzly. Attempts to haze the bear using non-lethal methods, including rubber bullets and bear spray deployment, proved unsuccessful in modifying its territorial behavior. The animal continued to patrol the area aggressively and showed no signs of developing appropriate fear responses to human presence. If anything, the hazing attempts seemed to increase the bear's agitation and territorial aggression. On April 2nd, Reed received word that Wyoming game and fish officials had made the difficult decision to destroy the aggressive grizzly after it had charged a wildlife biologist who was conducting routine monitoring in the area. The bear had been killed by wildlife officials using high-powered rifles, ending the threat it posed to anyone venturing into the Bear Creek wilderness area. Reed felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness as he learned of the bear's destruction. While the elimination of the threat was necessary for public safety, it also represented the loss of a magnificent wild animal that had simply been following its natural instincts in defending what it perceived as its territory. The incident highlighted the ongoing challenges involved in managing human-wildlife interactions in areas where development pressure and recreational use continued to expand into traditional wildlife habitat. The aftermath of the Morrison-Chen rescue and the subsequent destruction of the aggressive grizzly generated significant media attention and public discussion about wilderness safety and wildlife management policies. Morrison and Chen both made full recoveries from their injuries and became advocates for improved education about bear safety in backcountry areas. Morrison completed her thesis research on grizzly bear behavioral patterns, incorporating her personal experience with bear encounters into her academic work. Her research contributed to improved understanding of factors that could lead to aggressive behavior in grizzly bears and helped inform management strategies for preventing similar incidents in the future. Chen, meanwhile, developed a deeper appreciation for wilderness safety and began volunteering with search and rescue organizations to help educate backcountry users about proper preparation and safety protocols. His experience during the 24 hours trapped in the ravine had given him profound respect for the power of nature and the importance of being prepared for unexpected emergencies. Reed continued his law enforcement career with the Fremont County Sheriff's Department, though the Bear Creek incident remained one of the most challenging and memorable cases of his career. The successful rescue had required split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. and had demonstrated the critical importance of interagency cooperation in wilderness emergency response. The Bear Creek Trail system was eventually reopened to public access, though new warning signs and educational materials were installed to help visitors understand the risks associated with traveling in grizzly bear habitat. The incident served as a catalyst for improved bear safety education and highlighted the need for visitors to carry appropriate defensive equipment when venturing into predator habitat. Years later, Reed would reflect on the Bear Creek incident as an example of how quickly situations could change in the wilderness and how important it was for law enforcement personnel to be prepared for any type of emergency. The successful rescue of Morrison and Chen had required courage, skill, and more than a little luck, and Reed remained grateful that the operation had concluded with both hikers returning safely to their families. The story of the Bear Creek Grizzly became part of local folklore in Fremont County, serving as a reminder to residents and visitors alike of the wild nature of Wyoming's mountains and the respect that must be maintained for the powerful predators that called these wilderness areas home. The incident reinforced the understanding that while human presence in grizzly habitat was possible, it required constant vigilance, proper preparation, and a healthy respect for animals that possess the power to kill with casual ease. For Reed, Ortiz, Vanderberg, and the other personnel involved in the rescue operation, the Bear Creek incident represented both a professional success and a personal reminder of the dangers inherent in their chosen careers. Law enforcement in Wyoming's wilderness areas required a unique combination of traditional police skills and wilderness survival expertise, and the Bear Creek Rescue had tested both aspects of their training to the fullest extent. The incident also highlighted the critical importance of search and rescue capabilities in rural areas, where distances were vast and emergency response resources were often stretched thin. The successful coordination between local law enforcement, state wildlife officials, and air rescue units had been essential to the positive outcome, and the incident served as a case study for improving emergency response protocols in wilderness areas. As Reed continued his career with the Fremont County Sheriff's Department, he carried with him the lessons learned during those tense hours in the Bear Creek wilderness. The experience had reinforced his understanding of the importance of preparation, teamwork, and respect for the natural world, while also providing him with increased confidence in his ability to handle complex emergency situations in challenging environments. The Bear Creek incident would continue to influence Reed's approach to wilderness law enforcement throughout the remainder of his career, serving as a constant reminder that in Wyoming's mountains, officers must be prepared for anything, and that the margin between success and tragedy could be measured in seconds and split-second decisions made under extreme pressure. But the story that would haunt Reed's dreams and define his understanding of the true dangers lurking in Wyoming's wilderness was yet to unfold. The Bear Creek incident had been a successful rescue, a testament to training, preparation, and teamwork. What was about to happen on the morning of March 16, 2025, would be something altogether different. A confrontation with nature's raw power that would test every ounce of skill, courage, and luck that two veteran law enforcement officers could muster. The call came at 6:42 a.m. on what had started as a routine Monday morning. Reed had just finished his first cup of coffee and was reviewing the previous night's incident reports when the radio crackled with an urgent transmission from dispatch. A trucker traveling westbound on Highway 26 near Dubois had reported seeing what appeared to be a massive grizzly bear crossing the highway approximately 5 miles east of town, near the entrance to the Whiskey Mountain Wildlife Habitat area. Deputy Ortiz was already on patrol in the area, conducting routine traffic enforcement along the highway corridor that served as the primary route for commercial and recreational traffic traveling between central Wyoming and the Jackson Hole area. The highway traversed some of the most pristine wilderness areas in the state, including portions of the Shoshone National Forest and the Wind River Range, making wildlife encounters a constant concern for both law enforcement and travelers. Unit 23 to dispatch, Ortiz's voice crackled over the radio as he acknowledged the bear sighting report. I'm approximately 3 miles from the reported location, proceeding to investigate and establish a safety perimeter if necessary. Reed, who was designated as the shift supervisor that morning, immediately recognized the potential seriousness of the situation. Highway 26 carried significant commercial traffic, including large trucks hauling freight between regional distribution centers, and a grizzly bear in the roadway represented an extreme hazard to motorists who might encounter the animal unexpectedly. Unit 47 to Unit 23, Reed transmitted as he prepared to respond to assist Ortiz. I'm en route to your location. Maintain safe distance from any wildlife and establish traffic control if the bear is still in the highway area. Reed had worked with Ortiz for 3 years since the deputy's transfer from Denver, and he had complete confidence in his partner's abilities and judgment. Ortiz was a careful, methodical officer who understood the importance of safety protocols when dealing with dangerous wildlife, and Reed knew that he would not take unnecessary risks during the initial assessment of the situation. The drive from the sheriff's department to the reported bear location took Reed approximately 12 minutes, during which time he monitored radio traffic and coordinated with dispatch to ensure that Wyoming Game and Fish Department officials were notified of the potential highway hazard. Wildlife encounters on major highways required immediate response to prevent vehicle-wildlife collisions that could result in serious injuries or fatalities. As Reed approached the area where Ortiz was conducting his investigation, he could see the flashing lights of the deputy's patrol car positioned on the shoulder of the highway. Ortiz had established a preliminary traffic control point, using his vehicle to alert approaching motorists to reduce speed and exercise caution in the area. Reed pulled up behind Ortiz's patrol car and stepped out into the crisp morning air, immediately noting the pristine wilderness that surrounded the highway corridor. The Whiskey Mountain area was known for its diverse wildlife population, including one of the largest concentrations of grizzly bears in the state. The proximity to both the highway and populated areas made wildlife management in this region particularly challenging. "What do you have, Sam?" Reed asked, as he joined Ortiz beside the patrol car. Ortiz pointed toward a drainage area approximately 200 yards north of the highway, where a small creek flowed through dense willow thickets toward the Wind River. The trucker was right. There's definitely a bear in the area. Big grizzly, probably 500 pounds or more. It crossed the highway about 15 minutes ago and headed into that drainage system. Reed scanned the area with binoculars, searching for movement in the thick vegetation that could conceal a large animal. The terrain was ideal grizzly habitat, with abundant water, dense cover, and the type of riparian vegetation that supported the diverse food sources bears required for their survival. "Any indication it's moving back toward the highway?" Reed asked as he continued his surveillance of the drainage area. "Not so far, but it's definitely still in the immediate area. I can see movement in the willows every few minutes, and there's fresh sign all along the creek bottom. This bear's been working this drainage for a while." Reed understood the implications of Ortiz's assessment. Grizzly bears that established feeding or territorial patterns near major highways represented ongoing threats to public safety, as their movements were unpredictable and could bring them into contact with vehicle traffic at any time. The situation required careful monitoring and potentially intervention by wildlife management officials if the bear continued to frequent the highway corridor. The radio crackled with a transmission from dispatch, updating the officers on the response status of Wyoming Game and Fish personnel. Units 23 and 47, be advised that wildlife management officials are en route to your location. Estimated arrival in 20 minutes. Continue monitoring and maintain safe distance from the animal. Reed acknowledged the transmission and began coordinating with Ortiz to establish an expanded safety perimeter around the area where the bear had been observed. Their primary responsibility was to protect public safety by preventing vehicle-wildlife collisions while avoiding unnecessary confrontation with the animal. At 7:15 a.m., a Wyoming Department of Transportation maintenance crew arrived to assist with traffic control, deploying portable warning signs and establishing a reduced speed zone through the area where the bear had been sighted. The maintenance crew supervisor, a veteran employee named Robert Bob Mitchell, 53, had extensive experience dealing with wildlife hazards along Wyoming's highway system. "We see bears in this area pretty regularly," Mitchell explained to Reed as his crew positioned warning equipment. "Usually, they cross at dawn or dusk when traffic is lighter, but this time of year they can be unpredictable as they come out of hibernation." Reed nodded, understanding that spring was one of the most dangerous times for bear encounters as the animals emerged from winter hibernation with depleted fat reserves and aggressive appetites. Bears were often more willing to take risks during this period, including venturing into areas with human activity where they might normally avoid contact. The bear made its presence known again at 7:25 a.m., emerging from the willows approximately 150 yards from the highway and moving slowly along the creek bottom. Through binoculars, Reed could see that this was indeed an exceptionally large animal, probably a mature boar weighing 600 pounds or more. The bear's behavior appeared calm and focused on foraging, suggesting it was not immediately agitated by the human activity near the highway. Wyoming Game and Fish Warden Jennifer Louise McKenzie, 38, arrived at 7:30 a.m. with specialized equipment for managing wildlife situations on the highway. McKenzie was an 8-year veteran of wildlife law enforcement with extensive training in bear management and had dealt with dozens of similar situations throughout her career. "What's the bear's current status?" McKenzie asked Reed as she surveyed the scene and prepared her equipment for potential wildlife management action. Reed provided a detailed briefing on the bear's movements and behavior, emphasizing the animal's size and the fact that it appeared to be establishing a foraging pattern in the drainage area immediately adjacent to the highway. McKenzie listened carefully and began developing a strategy for monitoring the bear and potentially encouraging it to move away from the highway corridor. "This is probably a young male that's just establishing his territory," McKenzie observed as she watched the bear through her own binoculars. "The concerning thing is that he's showing no apparent awareness of or concern about the highway traffic. That could indicate habituation to human activity, which makes him more dangerous." Reed felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever wildlife encounters showed signs of escalating beyond routine situations. A habituated grizzly bear near a major highway represented a serious threat to public safety, and wildlife management options for dealing with such situations were often limited and always dangerous. The bear continued its foraging activities for the next 30 minutes, occasionally approaching within 100 yards of the highway before returning to the denser cover along the creek. McKenzie worked with Reed and Ortiz to establish observation points that would allow them to monitor the animal's movements while maintaining safe distances and preparing for potential intervention if the bear returned to the roadway. At 8:15 a.m., the situation escalated dramatically when a commercial truck driver, apparently unaware of the wildlife activity in the area, stopped his vehicle on the highway shoulder approximately 300 yards west of the law enforcement position. The driver, later identified as Mark Thomas Henderson, 49, of Billings, Montana, exited his truck and began walking toward the drainage area with what appeared to be a camera, apparently hoping to photograph the bear. "Oh, hell!" Ortiz muttered as he spotted Henderson's movement toward the bear habitat. That idiot's going to get himself killed. Reed immediately grabbed his radio to warn Henderson away from the area, but the truck driver was apparently too far away to hear radio transmissions and continued his approach toward the willows where the bear was foraging. Mackenzie began preparing tranquilizer equipment, recognizing that the situation might require immediate intervention to protect the civilian who was unknowingly approaching one of North America's most dangerous predators. "Sir! Sir! Stop where you are!" Reed shouted toward Henderson while activating his patrol car's public address system. "There is a dangerous wild animal in that area. Return to your vehicle immediately." Henderson apparently heard the warning and stopped his approach, but he remained standing in the open area between his truck and the willow thickets, clearly trying to spot the bear that law enforcement personnel were monitoring. His position placed him directly between the bear's current location and its most likely escape route back toward the deeper wilderness areas north of the highway. The bear, meanwhile, had apparently detected Henderson's presence and was beginning to show signs of agitation. Mackenzie could see through her binoculars that the animal had stopped foraging and was now standing alert, testing the air currents to gather information about the human activity in its territory. "This is going to go bad fast," Mackenzie warned Reed as she prepared her tranquilizer rifle for potential use. "That bear is aware of the human presence, and the guy is blocking its natural escape route. If the bear decides to investigate or feels threatened, it could charge." Reed made the decision to intervene directly, recognizing that Henderson's position created an immediate threat to both the civilian and the bear. "Sam, stay here and coordinate with Mackenzie. I'm going to get that guy back to his truck before this situation gets out of hand." Reed activated his patrol car's emergency lights and siren as he drove toward Henderson's position, hoping to emphasize the urgency of the situation and convince the truck driver to return to the safety of his vehicle. The patrol car's movement had the unintended consequence of further agitating the bear, which began moving through the willows in what appeared to be an investigative approach toward the human activity. "Unit 47, the bear is moving toward Henderson's position," Ortiz reported over the radio as he tracked the animal's movement through the dense vegetation. "You need to get him out of there right now." Reed reached Henderson's truck and exited his patrol car, immediately recognizing the gravity of the situation as he could see the willows moving with the bear's approach. Henderson, apparently oblivious to the immediate danger, was still trying to photograph wildlife and seemed annoyed by the law enforcement interference with his activities. "Sir, you need to get back in your truck immediately," Reed ordered Henderson, with the authority and urgency that came from 17 years of law enforcement experience. "There is a 600-pound grizzly bear approximately 100 yards from your position, and you are directly in its path." Henderson's attitude changed immediately as he realized the seriousness of the situation, and he began moving quickly back toward his truck. However, his rapid movement apparently triggered the bear's predatory instincts, and the animal emerged from the willows at a fast walk that could quickly escalate to a charge if the bear perceived a threat or opportunity. "Bear in the open!" Ortiz's voice crackled urgently over the radio. "Big boar, moving directly toward the highway, distance approximately 75 yards and closing." Reed felt his adrenaline spike as he realized that both he and Henderson were now in immediate danger from one of the most powerful predators in North America. The bear was moving with obvious purpose, its massive head swinging back and forth as it tested air currents and evaluated the human activity in its territory. Mackenzie had moved to a position where she could deploy tranquilizer equipment if necessary, but the range was marginal for accuracy with tranquilizer darts, and the drug's effect would not be immediate even with a successful hit. Reed knew from his training that a charging grizzly could cover 100 yards in approximately 6 seconds, far faster than any human could retreat to safety. "Get in the truck!" Reed shouted to Henderson as he drew his service weapon, knowing that his .40 caliber Glock would be marginal at best against a charging grizzly, but having no other defensive options available. Henderson scrambled into his truck cab and immediately started the engine, preparing to flee if the bear continued its approach. The bear reached the edge of the highway and paused, apparently confused by the noise and activity of the vehicle traffic. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the massive animal stood on the asphalt, its dark eyes scanning the scene and evaluating its options. Reed could see every detail of the bear's powerful physique, from the distinctive shoulder hump that marked it as a grizzly to the enormous claws that could shred metal like paper. Mackenzie seized the opportunity presented by the bear's momentary pause and fired a tranquilizer dart, her shot striking the animal in the hip. The bear reacted to the dart's impact with obvious agitation, spinning to bite at the injection site and demonstrating the explosive speed and power that made grizzlies so dangerous in close encounters. Rather than retreating into the wilderness, as everyone hoped, the tranquilized bear became increasingly agitated and began moving erratically along the highway, its behavior unpredictable as the drug began to take effect. The combination of tranquilizer drugs and adrenaline could create dangerous behavioral responses in grizzly bears, making them more aggressive rather than less. "All units, we have a drugged grizzly moving erratically on Highway 26, Reed reported over the radio as he tracked the bear's movement and prepared for multiple contingencies, requesting immediate highway closure and additional backup for public safety. The Wyoming Highway Patrol immediately began implementing emergency procedures to close the highway in both directions, but several vehicles were already in the immediate area and could not be safely rerouted away from the agitated bear. Reed and Ortiz found themselves in the position of protecting civilian motorists from an unpredictable and chemically altered grizzly bear that possessed the strength to destroy vehicles and kill humans with casual ease. The bear's behavior became increasingly erratic as the tranquilizer began to affect its coordination and judgment. Instead of retreating to the wilderness, the animal began investigating the vehicles stopped along the highway, showing particular interest in Reed's patrol car, which was positioned between the bear and several civilian vehicles. "Sam, get those civilians moved back," Reed ordered Ortiz, as he maintained his position near the patrol car, hoping to draw the bear's attention away from the more vulnerable civilian vehicles. "I'm going to try to keep the bear focused on the patrol car until the drugs take full effect." Ortiz began coordinating the evacuation of civilian vehicles from the immediate danger zone, working with Wyoming Highway Patrol units that had arrived to assist with traffic control. The presence of multiple vehicles and personnel created a complex and dangerous situation, as the bear could focus its attention on any target and potentially cause multiple casualties with a single aggressive action. The grizzly approached Reed's patrol car with obvious curiosity, using its powerful claws to investigate the vehicle's exterior and causing significant damage to the paint and body panels. Reed remained inside the vehicle, monitoring the bear's behavior and preparing to take defensive action if the animal attempted to gain access to the passenger compartment. "Unit 47, what's the bear's current status?" Mackenzie's voice came over the radio as she prepared additional tranquilizer equipment and coordinated with other wildlife management personnel who were responding to the scene. "The bear is investigating my patrol car," Reed reported, trying to keep his voice calm despite the surreal nature of his situation. "Significant damage to the exterior, but the animal appears more curious than aggressive at this point." The bear's investigation of the patrol car became more aggressive as the tranquilizer drugs continued to affect its behavior and judgment. The animal began using its claws to scrape at the windows and door handles, apparently attempting to access the interior of the vehicle where Reed was positioned. Reed felt his heart rate accelerate as he realized the bear's investigation was escalating toward a more serious assault on the vehicle. The patrol car's windows and doors were not designed to withstand the concentrated attack of a 600-pound grizzly bear, and Reed knew that the vehicle's protection was limited and temporary at best. The situation reached a critical point when the bear reared up on its hind legs and brought its full weight down on the patrol car's hood, causing significant structural damage and demonstrating the enormous strength that made grizzlies so dangerous. The impact rocked the vehicle violently, and Reed could hear metal bending and glass beginning to crack under the bear's assault. "The bear is attacking the patrol car," Ortiz reported urgently over the radio as he watched the escalating situation from his position, coordinating civilian evacuation. "Tom's trapped inside, and the vehicle is taking serious damage." Mackenzie prepared to fire a second tranquilizer dart, hoping to increase the dosage of drugs in the bear's system and accelerate the sedation process. However, the bear's position on top of the patrol car made accurate dart placement difficult, and a missed shot could further agitate the animal and increase the danger to Reed. The bear's assault on the patrol car intensified as it used its massive claws to scrape at the windshield, creating deep gouges in the safety glass and gradually weakening the barrier between itself and Reed. The officer found himself in the terrifying position of being trapped inside a vehicle that was being systematically destroyed by one of nature's most powerful predators. Reed keyed his radio to provide a status update, his voice tight with controlled fear as he assessed his rapidly deteriorating situation. "Unit 47 to all units. The bear is attempting to gain access to the patrol car through the windshield. The vehicle is taking severe damage, and I may need immediate assistance." Ditati, the Wyoming Highway Patrol helicopter that had been dispatched to assist with the situation, arrived overhead just as the bear's assault on the patrol car reached its most violent phase. Captain Janet Reeves, the same pilot who had participated in the Bear Creek rescue operation, immediately recognized the extreme danger Reed faced and began coordinating with ground personnel to develop a rescue plan. "Ground units, this is Air Rescue 12, Captain Reeves transmitted over the radio as she assessed the situation from above. "We have visual on the bear attacking the patrol car. Officer appears to be trapped inside the vehicle. Requesting immediate ground support for rescue operations. The bear's attack on the windshield finally succeeded in creating a significant crack in the safety glass, allowing the animal to begin peeling away portions of the windshield and potentially gain access to the vehicle's interior." Reed realized that his position inside the patrol car was no longer tenable, and that he would need to attempt an escape before the bear completely destroyed his protection. "I'm going to try to exit the vehicle and reach the second patrol car," Reed transmitted over the radio as he prepared for what would be an extremely dangerous sprint across open ground with an agitated grizzly bear in immediate proximity. "Negative, Unit 47? Ortiz's voice crackled urgently over the radio. "Stay in the vehicle. We're coordinating helicopter support for your extraction." The bear's attention was suddenly diverted by the noise of the helicopter overhead, and the animal temporarily ceased its assault on the patrol car to investigate this new source of disturbance. Captain Reeves used the opportunity to position her aircraft for a potential rescue operation, though extracting Reed from his position would require precise timing and coordination. Mackenzie fired her second tranquilizer dart during the bear's momentary distraction, this time achieving a solid hit in the animal's shoulder. The additional drugs in the bear's system began to show immediate effects, with the animal's movements becoming noticeably less coordinated and its aggression beginning to diminish. "Second dart successful," Mackenzie reported over the radio. "The bear should begin showing significant sedation effects within the next 5 to 10 minutes. Reed remained inside the damaged patrol car as the bear's behavior gradually transitioned from aggressive curiosity to the confused lethargy that characterized tranquilizer drug effects. The animal's movements became increasingly unsteady, and it eventually abandoned its assault on the vehicle to lie down beside the highway. "Bear is down," Ortiz reported as he observed the animal's condition through binoculars. "Appears to be heavily sedated and no longer representing an immediate threat." Reed carefully exited the severely damaged patrol car and assessed both his own condition and the extent of damage the bear had inflicted on the vehicle. The patrol car's hood was deeply dented. The windshield was extensively cracked and partially destroyed, and deep claw marks scored the paint and body panels throughout the vehicle. "Unit 47 is out of the vehicle and appears uninjured," Reed reported over the radio as he moved to a safe position away from the sedated bear. "Vehicle is extensively damaged but still operational." Mackenzie approached the sedated bear with caution, confirming that the animal was fully unconscious and posed no immediate threat to personnel working in the area. The bear would remain unconscious for several hours, providing wildlife management officials with the opportunity to relocate the animal to a more remote area where it would be less likely to encounter human activity. The aftermath of the incident required extensive coordination between multiple agencies to clear the highway, document the damage, and develop a plan for relocating the bear to prevent future conflicts. Reed's patrol car was removed from service pending extensive repairs, and a detailed incident report was required to document the unusual circumstances of the encounter. "Tom, you okay?" Ortiz asked Reed as they stood beside the damaged patrol car and surveyed the scene of the morning's dramatic events. Reed nodded, though he was still processing the adrenaline rush and fear that had accompanied his 20-minute ordeal trapped inside a vehicle being attacked by a grizzly bear. "Yeah, I'm fine, but I don't think I'll ever look at routine traffic stops the same way again." The incident would become legendary within the Fremont County Sheriff's Department and throughout Wyoming law enforcement circles as an example of the unpredictable dangers that officers faced when working in areas with dangerous wildlife. Reed's calm professionalism during the crisis had prevented civilian casualties and had allowed wildlife management officials to safely resolve the situation without harm to either humans or the bear. The grizzly was successfully relocated to a remote area of the Bridger-Teton National Forest, where it would have minimal contact with human activity. Wildlife management officials implemented additional monitoring protocols to track the bear's movements and ensure that it did not return to areas near major highways or populated areas. Reed returned to duty after a brief administrative leave to recover from the psychological stress of the incident, though he would carry with him for the rest of his career the memory of being trapped inside a vehicle while a 600-pound grizzly bear attempted to gain access. The experience reinforced his respect for Wyoming's wildlife and his understanding of the constant vigilance required when working in areas shared with some of North America's most powerful predators. The damaged patrol car became something of a local celebrity, with law enforcement personnel from throughout the region visiting to see the claw marks and structural damage that demonstrated the raw power of a grizzly bear. The vehicle was eventually repaired and returned to service, though Reed arranged to be assigned to a different patrol car, feeling that he had developed too personal a relationship with Unit 47. For Ortiz, the incident served as a dramatic introduction to the unique challenges of law enforcement in Wyoming's wilderness areas. His experience coordinating the civilian evacuation and assisting with the bear management operation demonstrated the complex skills required for rural law enforcement and prepared him for the diverse challenges he would face throughout his career. The Highway Bear incident would be referenced in law enforcement training programs throughout the region as an example of proper protocol for managing wildlife encounters and the importance of interagency cooperation in emergency situations. Reed's actions during the crisis became a case study in maintaining composure under extreme pressure and effectively communicating with multiple agencies during complex emergency operations. But as Reed would discover, the morning's encounter with the highway grizzly was merely a preview of the true test that awaited him and Ortiz in the wilderness areas of Fremont County. The skills, courage, and teamwork they had demonstrated during the highway incident would all be required in even greater measure when they faced their ultimate confrontation with the raw power of Wyoming's wilderness and the apex predators that ruled these remote and dangerous territories.